A straight razor doesn't discriminate. It shaves, cuts, kills. Danny Barber's customers sat in his chair, trusting him with their throats, never knowing some would never leave. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're diving into 4 chilling stories you don't want to miss. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of the barber who collected more than hair. Now, relax, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We're tracking a predator who hid behind smiles and small talk, whose hunting ground was a place where men came to look their best. But for some, it became the last chair they'd ever sit in. This is the story of Danny Barber, a man whose hands were trained to perfect the closest shave, but who discovered an appetite for something far darker than grooming. Danny Barber wasn't the kind of man you'd cross the street to avoid. Clean-cut, soft-spoken, with the kind of easy charm that made strangers feel like old friends within minutes. He was the barbershop fixture everyone knew by name. In the heart of a quiet southern town where everyone knew everyone else's business, Danny ran his modest shop on Maple Street, a corner establishment with faded red and white stripes spiraling endlessly on the pole outside. The shop smelled perpetually of bay rum aftershave and leather, walls lined with vintage photographs of men in fedoras and perfectly pomaded hair. Danny had inherited the business from his father, who'd inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of barbers cutting hair on the same scarred linoleum floor, using some of the same straight razors that had been honed and stropped for decades. There was tradition in those walls, history in every nick on the wooden chairs. But history has a way of concealing rot beneath its veneer. Danny's customers were loyal, farmers who'd come in every 2 weeks like clockwork, businessmen who scheduled their appointments months in advance, teenagers getting their first proper shave. They'd settle into his chair, drape across their chests, and tilt their heads back in complete vulnerability while Danny's blade whispered across their skin. That's the thing about barbershops that most people don't consider. The absolute trust required. You're offering up your throat to someone with a weapon sharp enough to split a hair lengthwise, trusting they'll stop at stubble. Most barbers honor that trust. Danny Barber was not most barbers. The first hint that something was wrong came not from screams or blood, but from absence. In small towns, absence speaks louder than presence. When Robert McKinney, a regular who came in every other Thursday at 4 o'clock sharp, missed his appointment without calling, his wife thought nothing of it. When he didn't come home that night, she worried. When he didn't come home the next night, she called the police. Robert McKinney was a man of ironclad routine. He taught chemistry at the high school, coached junior varsity baseball, and never, ever missed dinner with his family. His car was found 3 days later in the parking lot behind Danny's barbershop. Keys still in the ignition, wallet untouched on the dashboard. But Robert himself had vanished as completely as morning mist under a harsh sun. The investigation went nowhere. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no witnesses who saw anything unusual. Danny told police that Robert had indeed come in for his appointment, had gotten his usual trim and shave, had paid in cash, and had left around 4:30. Danny remembered because he'd had another customer coming in at 5, and he'd had to rush to clean up Robert's hair clippings. The police believed him. Why wouldn't they? Danny Barber was a pillar of the community, a businessman whose family had served this town for 3 generations. His alibi was the barbershop itself. Dozens of people came through those doors every week. How could anyone commit a crime in such a public place? They didn't understand that the best hiding places are often in plain sight. 6 weeks later, Marcus Holwell disappeared under nearly identical circumstances. Last seen heading to Danny's barbershop for an evening appointment, his truck found abandoned 2 blocks away. No trace of the man himself. Marcus was a construction worker, built like a bull, the kind of man you'd expect could handle himself in a fight. His wife told investigators that Marcus had mentioned wanting to try a straight razor shave, something traditional, something his grandfather used to get. That's when patterns began to emerge from the fog of confusion. Two men, both customers of Danny Barber, both vanished after visiting his shop. Both last seen alive entering that building with its cheerful striped pole spinning endlessly, hypnotically, drawing people in. But patterns don't equal proof, and small-town police departments don't have the resources or expertise for complex investigations. The FBI wasn't interested. These were adults, not children, and there was no evidence of kidnapping or interstate crime. The case went cold despite the community's growing unease, despite the whispers that started following Danny down grocery store aisles and through church parking lots. Danny continued cutting hair. Fewer customers came, but some remained loyal. After all, where was the evidence? This was America. You're innocent until proven guilty, and Danny Barber hadn't been proven anything except good at his job and unlucky in having customers who disappeared. The third victim was named Thomas Yates, though by the time he walked into Danny's shop on a muggy August afternoon, the word victim hadn't yet attached itself to his name. Thomas was a traveling salesman, just passing through, saw the barbershop and decided his shaggy hair needed attention before his next client meeting. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong barber. Thomas's body was the one that changed everything. A flash flood 3 months later washed out a section of embankment along the river that ran behind several downtown businesses, including the barbershop. What the water revealed made seasoned investigators vomit in the bushes. Wrapped in plastic sheeting that had partially deteriorated, Thomas Yates had been buried in a shallow grave. His throat opened ear to ear with a precision that spoke of practice and familiarity with extremely sharp blades. The autopsy revealed something that made the medical examiner's hands shake as he typed his report. The cut was almost surgical in its exactness, the kind of wound you'd see from someone who knew exactly how to use a straight razor, who'd made this same motion thousands upon thousands of times. When police excavated further, they found Robert McKinney, then Marcus Holwell, then 3 more bodies no one had even reported missing yet. Drifters, homeless men, people whose absence wouldn't trigger missing person reports, whose deaths wouldn't ripple through a community because they'd never been firmly part of that community to begin with. 6 bodies, 6 throats opened with professional precision. 6 men who'd made the fatal mistake of sitting in Danny Barber's chair, tilting their heads back, exposing their most vulnerable anatomy to a man who'd learned to see people not as humans but as opportunities. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. Danny was setting up his shop, arranging his tools with the same meticulous care he always had. Combs in order, scissors sharpened, straight razors stropped to lethal perfection. When police kicked in the door, weapons drawn, screaming for him to get on the ground, witnesses said he simply smiled. That smile would haunt everyone who saw it for years to come. The barbershop yielded its secrets reluctantly, like pulling teeth from a corpse's skull. On the surface, everything appeared normal, perhaps too normal, too carefully maintained, too perfectly ordinary. But forensic investigators know that monsters don't advertise their true nature with obvious signs. Evil wears a mask of banality, and Danny Barber had perfected that disguise over years of practice. The main floor of the shop revealed nothing immediately incriminating. The barber's chair was old but well-maintained, the leather cracked but clean. Shelves held the expected inventory: hair tonics, pomades, aftershaves, all arranged with obsessive precision. The magazines in the waiting area were current, the floor recently swept. If you'd walked in without knowing what investigators were looking for, you'd have seen nothing more sinister than any small-town business operating on thin margins and thinner profits. But crime scene investigators aren't casual observers. They notice what shouldn't be there just as much as what should be. They photograph angles and measure distances and spray luminol in dark rooms to make blood sing out its presence even after desperate scrubbing. The trapdoor was discovered beneath a worn rug in the storage room where Danny kept his supplies. Most people never went back there. Customers certainly didn't, and even regular staff members. Danny employed a part-time receptionist who worked mornings, had no reason to access that particular closet. The door itself was masterfully concealed, flush with the floor, handle recessed and easy to miss unless you were looking for it. What lay beneath made seasoned detectives question whether they'd actually descended into hell itself. The basement wasn't large, perhaps 15 by 20 feet, with walls of exposed brick that wept with moisture. A single bare bulb provided illumination, casting shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse with malevolent energy. But it wasn't the size or the atmosphere that made investigators' skin crawl. It was what the space contained. A chair stood in the center, bolted to the concrete floor. Not a barber's chair, though it shared certain similarities, a place to sit, a headrest, armrests. But this chair had restraints. Heavy leather straps, darkened and stiff with old blood, designed to immobilize arms, legs, torso, head. The metal buckles were worn smooth from repeated use, and the leather showed stress marks where victims had struggled against inevitable fate. Next to the chair, arranged on a stainless steel tray with surgical precision, lay Danny's true collection. Straight razors of every size and description. Some were antiques, ivory-handled beauties with blades that had been honed to microscopic sharpness. Others were modern, utilitarian, designed for function rather than aesthetic appeal. Each one was spotlessly clean, maintained with the same care Danny had shown his legitimate barbering tools upstairs. The walls told stories in rust-brown stains that luminol confirmed as blood spatter. Despite Danny's obvious attempts at cleaning, bleach bottles were found in the corner, along with industrial-strength cleansers and a mop so worn it was nearly threadbare. Enough trace evidence remained to build a timeline of horror. Multiple victims had died in that room, their blood painting abstract patterns across brick that would never quite wash clean. Forensic analysis revealed something even more chilling. The blood patterns indicated victims were conscious when their throats were cut. The arterial spray, the positioning of stains, the evidence of struggle against restraints all pointed to the same conclusion. Danny didn't knock his victims unconscious. He didn't drug them into compliance. He wanted them awake, aware, experiencing every second of their murder. Investigators theorized about his method based on physical evidence and the layout of both floors. Danny would close the shop, either at legitimate closing time or by turning away other customers if an opportunity presented itself. He'd position his chosen victim in the barber's chair upstairs, tilt them back for a shave or final trim, and then, the precise method was never completely confirmed, subdue them somehow before dragging or carrying them to the basement. The trapdoor was positioned perfectly for this purpose, a straight drop into his kill room. Once in the basement, Danny would bind his victims to the chair, and then he'd do what he did best. He'd give them a shave. But this time, the razor wouldn't stop at whiskers. Psychiatric evaluations after his arrest revealed a man who viewed murder as a natural extension of his profession. Danny told court-appointed psychiatrists that cutting hair and cutting throats weren't fundamentally different actions. Both required steady hands, both demanded precision, both transformed the subject from one state to another. He spoke about his murders with the same calm professionalism he'd used when discussing haircut styles with customers. "You have to understand the angle," he'd explained during one evaluation, his voice clinical and detached. "Too shallow and you're just making a mess. Too deep and you hit vertebrae, which ruins the blade's edge. There's an art to it, same as there's an art to a proper fade or a clean straight razor shave. You have to respect the craft." The psychiatrists diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder with sadistic features, psychological jargon that translated roughly to human-shaped monster. He showed no remorse, no empathy, no recognition that his victims had been people with families and futures and rights to their own lives. To Danny Barber, they'd been nothing more than opportunities to practice his craft, bodies that existed for his use and disposal. Evidence logs documented the contents of his basement in exhaustive detail: the restraint chair, the razors, the blood evidence, the cleaning supplies. But they also found journals, 3 spiral-bound notebooks filled with Danny's small, neat handwriting. These journals documented his evolution from barber to killer, tracking his thoughts and fantasies over nearly 5 years before he'd acted on them. The earliest entries were relatively benign, if disturbing. Observations about how vulnerable his customers were, how easily he could kill them if he wanted to, how thin the line was between a close shave and a fatal cut. But over time, the entries grew darker, more detailed, more focused on specific individuals. He'd identified potential victims months before killing them, had studied their routines, had planned exactly when and how he'd take them. Robert McKinney, the first confirmed victim, appeared in the journals 8 months before his disappearance. Danny had noted which days Robert came in, how he liked his haircut, whether he tipped well. He'd written about Robert's habit of closing his eyes during the shave, about how trusting he was, about how easy it would be. RM. Came in today, one entry read. He always tilts his head back and closes his eyes when I do his neck. Doesn't even flinch when the blade gets close to his carotid. Sometimes I hold the razor there for a moment longer than necessary, just to see if he notices. He never does. They never do. They trust me completely. The journals also revealed victims beyond the 6 found buried by the river. Danny wrote about practice runs. Homeless men he'd lured into the shop after hours. People whose deaths he didn't even bother documenting beyond brief entries noting what worked and what didn't in his technique. Investigators estimated the true body count could be as high as 12, though without bodies or missing person reports, exact numbers remained speculation. Perhaps most disturbing was Danny's attention to detail about the act of murder itself. He documented how long it took for consciousness to fade after a throat was cut, which angle produced the most dramatic blood flow, how different body types responded to blood loss. His journals read like a twisted combination of diary and laboratory notebook, personal reflections mixed with clinical observations. The basement, the journals, the physical evidence all painted a portrait of a man who'd turned murder into both art and science, who'd studied death with the same dedication he'd once applied to learning barbering techniques from his father and grandfather. But evidence of crimes committed only tells part of the story. Understanding who Danny Barber was, or perhaps more accurately, understanding what he'd become, required diving deeper into his history, his psychology, his transformation from trusted tradesman to calculating killer. That's where the investigation took its darkest turn. Every killer has an origin story, though the line between explanation and excuse blurs dangerously in retrospective analysis. Danny Barber's past didn't excuse his present, but it illuminated the shadows where monsters grow in secret, feeding on darkness until they're strong enough to hunt in daylight. Danny was born in 1978 to Richard and Martha Barber, third-generation owners of Barber's Barbershop. His childhood was unremarkable in the way many small-town childhoods are. Little league baseball, Sunday church services, summer days that stretched into endless twilights. Neighbors described him as a quiet child, perhaps too quiet, the kind of boy who preferred observing to participating, who stood at the edges of playgrounds watching other children rather than joining their games. His father, Richard, was a stern man who believed in discipline administered through leather belts and harsh words. Former customers remembered Richard as professional but cold, a man who could cut hair with precision but couldn't maintain a conversation beyond weather and sports scores. He'd inherited the shop from his own father with an expectation that Danny would eventually do the same. Barbering was the family business, and family business was obligation, not choice. Danny's mother, Martha, was a ghost in her own life, made insubstantial by years of subservience to an overbearing husband. She worked as a checkout clerk at the local grocery store, came home to cook dinner, cleaned the house until it gleamed, and spoke so rarely that neighbors sometimes forgot she existed. When interviewed after Danny's arrest, she claimed she'd known nothing about his crimes, had never suspected, had been completely blindsided. Investigators doubted her ignorance but couldn't prove otherwise. School records painted a picture of a mediocre student, CS and BS, nothing remarkable, nothing concerning. Teachers described Danny as compliant but disengaged, a student who completed assignments adequately but showed no passion for any subject. He had few friends, no close relationships, no romantic interests that anyone could recall. He existed without making much impression, moving through adolescence like smoke. Present but insubstantial, there but barely. The first documented sign of Danny's darker impulses appeared when he was 14. A neighborhood cat went missing, found 3 days later in the alley behind the barbershop, throat cut with surgical precision. Police investigated briefly but concluded it was probably teenagers being cruel, the kind of animal torture that happens in small towns where boredom breeds brutality. The case was never solved, though in retrospect, the parallels to Danny's later murders were unmistakable. More cats disappeared over the following years. Then dogs. Small animals found dead with their throats opened, wounds too clean to be from other animals, too precise to be accidents. But again, no one connected these killings to the quiet barber's son, who spent his afternoons sweeping hair and polishing scissors while his father taught him the family trade. Danny graduated high school without ceremony or celebration, immediately beginning full-time work at the barbershop. His father's teaching methods were harsh. Mistakes earned verbal abuse and occasionally physical punishment, a slap to the back of the head, a painful twist of the ear. Richard Barber believed perfection was the only acceptable standard, and he drilled that belief into his son through repetition and fear. Hold the razor at 15 degrees. Richard would bark while Danny practiced on balloons. Pop one and you'd face consequences. Steady hands, steady pressure. You're not hacking at weeds here, you're performing surgery. One mistake and you've scarred a customer for life. Danny learned his lessons well, perhaps too well. Richard Barber died in 2003 of a heart attack, collapsing behind the barber chair where he'd spent 40 years of his life. Danny found him there in the morning, cold and stiff, scissors still clutched in one hand. Martha sold the house and moved to Florida within 6 months, leaving Danny sole proprietor of the family business. She never returned, never called, severed all contact with her son as cleanly as one of his straight razor cuts. This abandonment seemed to trigger something in Danny. Former customers noticed subtle changes. He became friendlier, more talkative, almost gregarious in his attempts to engage clients in conversation. But there was something performative about his new personality, like he was playing a role rather than being genuine. His smiles didn't quite reach his eyes, and his laughter came half a second too late, as if he was remembering to react rather than reacting naturally. The journals suggested this was when his fantasies intensified from abstract thoughts to concrete planning. Without his father's harsh oversight and his mother's passive presence, Danny existed in complete isolation, accountable to no one, monitored by nothing except his own deteriorating conscience. Psychological experts who evaluated Danny after his arrest debated endlessly about whether he was born with the capacity for murder or whether it was beaten into him by his father's cruelty and his mother's absence. Some argued that antisocial personality disorder has genetic components, that Danny's brain was simply wired differently from birth, lacking the neural architecture for empathy or moral reasoning. Others insisted that years of abuse and isolation had twisted a potentially normal child into a killer, that different circumstances might have produced a different outcome. Danny himself offered no insights into his own psychology. When asked why he'd started killing, he shrugged. When pressed about how he felt looking into his victims' eyes as they died, he described it as interesting, but nothing more profound. He showed no curiosity about his own motivations, no desire for self-understanding. He'd wanted to kill people, so he'd killed people. The reasoning was that simple, that horrifying. What made Danny particularly dangerous was his intelligence, not in terms of IQ scores, his tested at a thoroughly average 105, but in terms of practical cunning. He'd understood instinctively that to get away with murder, you needed to be methodical, patient, and above all, ordinary. He'd maintained his facade of normalcy for years, being active in his church, though he privately admitted feeling nothing during services. Volunteering for community events, good for maintaining his reputation, and generally presenting himself as exactly what people expected a small-town barber to be. His selection of victims showed similar calculation. The first 3 were local men, but chosen specifically because they had reasons to potentially disappear. Robert McKinney had been having financial troubles that colleagues knew about. Marcus Holwell had mentioned to friends he was considering moving to find better construction work. Thomas Yates was just passing through. Danny had been building a pattern of plausible deniability, ensuring that each disappearance could be explained by circumstances other than murder. The later victims, the homeless men, the drifters, were selected precisely because they wouldn't be missed at all, wouldn't trigger investigations, wouldn't ripple through the community. Danny had learned from his mistakes with the first victims, adapted his strategy, and might have continued killing indefinitely if not for that flash flood revealing what he'd buried. One detail from the investigation haunted detectives more than any other. During a search of Danny's home, they found photo albums meticulously maintained with pictures of him posing with customers. Hundreds of photographs, stretching back years, showing Danny standing behind his barber chair, scissors in hand, smiling at the camera while clients sat before him. Among these normal photographs were images of his 6 confirmed victims, taken during legitimate haircuts months before their murders. Danny had kept trophies not of their deaths but of their lives, documented moments of normalcy with men he'd already decided would die. He'd shaken their hands, made small talk, trimmed their hair, and smiled for photographs, all while knowing he'd eventually strap them to a chair in his basement and open their throats. That level of premeditation, that complete compartmentalization of his public and private selves, marked Danny Barber as something beyond the typical crime of passion killer. He was organized, controlled, and terrifyingly patient, characteristics that made him successful at murder but also ensured his eventual life sentence would be served in maximum security, isolated from other inmates, monitored constantly for everyone's safety, including his own. The trial of Danny Barber became a media sensation, though the town where he'd lived and killed tried desperately to avoid the spotlight. News vans parked outside the courthouse for months. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, and the barbershop with its cheerful striped pole became a macabre tourist attraction until the town council finally had it demolished. Danny's defense team faced an impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming: bodies, DNA, journals documenting his crimes in his own handwriting, forensic evidence tying him conclusively to the murders. Their only strategy was to argue for life in prison rather than execution, painting Danny as profoundly mentally ill rather than criminally evil, as if that distinction mattered to the families of 6 murdered men. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Victoria Chun, built their case methodically. They brought forensic experts who explained in gruesome detail how each victim had died. They presented Danny's journals, reading passages aloud that made jury members visibly ill. They called family members to testify about the men who'd been taken, forcing the court to see victims not as abstract concepts but as fathers, brothers, sons, husbands. Robert McKinney's widow testified about the hole in her family that would never heal, about their daughter asking when Daddy was coming home, about the wedding anniversary they'd never celebrate. Marcus Holwell's elderly mother, wheelchair-bound and trembling, told the court about watching her son grow from a boy into a strong man, only to have him vanish as if he'd never existed at all. Thomas Yates's brother flew in from Oregon to speak about childhood memories, about promises of future visits that would never happen. Danny sat through all of it with minimal expression, occasionally taking notes, sometimes leaning over to whisper to his attorneys. Observers reported that he seemed more interested in the legal proceedings as intellectual exercise than emotionally engaged with the suffering his actions had caused. When the prosecution showed photographs of the victims' bodies, Danny examined them with the clinical detachment of a student reviewing textbook illustrations. His attorneys put forth a defense centered on childhood trauma and mental illness. They called psychiatrists who testified about antisocial personality disorder, about the effects of prolonged childhood abuse, about the absence of maternal bonding and the presence of an authoritarian, violent father figure. They argued that Danny's brain was fundamentally different from normal humans, that he lacked the neural capacity for empathy or moral reasoning, that he was essentially a biological machine incapable of understanding the wrongness of his actions. The prosecution countered with their own experts who pointed out that Danny had demonstrated clear understanding of right and wrong. He'd hidden his crimes, had cleaned his kill room, had maintained a facade of normalcy for years. These weren't the actions of someone who didn't understand morality. These were the actions of someone who understood it perfectly well and chose to violate it anyway. When Danny finally took the stand in his own defense, against his attorney's strong advice, the courtroom fell into a silence so complete you could hear hearts beating. For 3 hours, prosecutors questioned him about his crimes, about his victims, about his journals. Danny answered every question calmly, factually, with the same tone he might use to describe haircut techniques. "Did you feel any remorse when you killed Robert McKinney?" the prosecutor asked. "No," Danny replied simply. Did you understand that what you were doing was wrong? I understood that it was illegal. Whether it was wrong is more philosophical. Did you enjoy killing these men? Enjoy isn't the right word. It was satisfying, like completing any skilled task correctly. His complete lack of effect, his reduction of murder to technical achievement, his inability or unwillingness to acknowledge the humanity of his victims sealed his fate more effectively than any evidence could. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. 6 counts of first-degree murder, 6 counts of kidnapping, multiple counts of abuse of a corpse. The sentencing phase took another month. Danny's attorneys argued passionately for life in prison, presenting more psychiatric testimony about his mental illness, about the possibility, however remote, of treatment and rehabilitation. The prosecution argued just as passionately for death, presenting victim impact statements that left the courtroom in tears, describing in painful detail the emptiness left by 6 murdered men. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Holloway who'd served on the bench for 23 years, delivered the sentence with visible emotion. She acknowledged Danny's troubled childhood, his documented mental illness, his attorney's compelling arguments for mercy. Then she sentenced him to death, citing the calculated nature of his crimes, the suffering inflicted on his victims, and the complete absence of remorse or understanding that human lives had value beyond his personal gratification. Danny received the sentence with the same flat expression he'd maintained throughout the trial. No tears, no outburst, no reaction whatsoever. He was escorted from the courtroom in chains, bound for death row in the state's maximum security prison, and most people in that town hoped they'd never hear his name again. But death row is where Danny Barber remains to this day, years after his conviction, still alive while his victims are still dead. The appeals process grinds forward with agonizing slowness. Constitutional challenges, competency hearings, automatic reviews that stretch justice so thin it becomes nearly transparent. Danny gives occasional interviews to journalists and true crime authors, speaking about his crimes with the same clinical detachment he showed during trial, seemingly unbothered by his confinement or his eventual fate. The families of his victims exist in a different kind of prison, one without walls but equally inescapable. They've formed a support group, meeting monthly to share their ongoing grief, to mark birthdays and anniversaries of men who should be present but aren't. Robert McKinney's daughter graduated college without her father in the audience. Marcus Holwell's mother died 2 years after the trial, her last words reportedly expressing relief that she'd at least lived to see justice served. Thomas Yates's brother developed a drinking problem he's still fighting. The barbershop's demolition didn't erase what happened there. The lot sits empty now, a gap between buildings like a missing tooth, and locals avoid it instinctively, taking longer routes to their destinations rather than walk past the space where Danny Barber practiced his dual trades. Paranormal investigators claim the site is haunted, reporting cold spots and unexplained sounds, though skeptics note that no location needs actual ghosts when the memory of real horror is more than sufficient. Other barbers in town reported business declining sharply after the trial, an irrational association between one man's evil and an entire profession, but human psychology rarely obeys rational rules. 2 shops closed within a year. The remaining ones had to mount marketing campaigns emphasizing new ownership, different people, no connection to the killer who'd shared their trade. The true crime community devoured Danny Barber's story, producing dozens of podcasts, YouTube videos, and articles dissecting every detail of his crimes and psychology. Some of this coverage was respectful and well-researched, but much of it sensationalized and exploited, turning real tragedy into entertainment. The families of the victims have repeatedly requested that people stop glorifying Danny, stop making him famous, stop giving him the attention that likely feeds whatever twisted satisfaction he's capable of feeling. Because that's the final horror of cases like Danny Barber's. The killer lives on, becomes infamous, gets written about and discussed and analyzed endlessly, while his victims fade into footnotes, remembered primarily for the manner of their deaths rather than the substance of their lives. Robert McKinney was a chemistry teacher who made science accessible and fun for students who'd otherwise hate the subject. Marcus Holwell built houses that families would live in for generations. Thomas Yates was working his way through college, selling during the day and studying at night. The other three victims, Michael Torres, James Beckman, and William Bill Harding, were homeless men, but they were also human beings with histories and hopes, people who mattered even if society had largely written them off. These men deserved better than to be remembered as Danny Barber's victims. They deserved to be remembered as themselves complex, flawed, fully human. But memory is cruel and selective, and what sticks in collective consciousness is often the sensational rather than the subtle, the horrifying rather than the humane. Danny Barber sits on death row, waiting for an execution that may or may not ever come, that may arrive in 5 years or 25, if it arrives at all. He passes time reading, corresponding with the morbidly curious who write to him, and according to prison reports, he's learned to cut inmates' hair. A privilege extended for good behavior that his victims' families find obscenely cruel. The monster wears a mundane face and lives a mundane life, reduced to a cell and routine and the slow erosion of years. There's no dramatic ending to this story, no climactic justice that satisfies our narrative craving for resolution. There's only the grinding continuation of existence for everyone touched by Danny Barber's evil. The families who grieve, the community that remembers, and the killer himself, waiting in a cage of his own making. Justice was served, technically. Danny Barber will never kill again, will never walk free, will eventually die either by execution or natural causes, likely still feeling nothing, still understanding nothing beyond his own narrow satisfaction. But for the families of 6 murdered men, justice is a hollow victory, a consolation prize that can't bring back what was taken, can't undo what was done, can't make the world right again. The barbershop pole stopped spinning years ago, but the horror it concealed continues to echo through lives shattered by one man's monstrous transformation of a trusted trade into a killing ground. Danny Barber took familiar comfort. The neighborhood barbershop, the friendly tradesman, the close shave, and weaponized it, proving that evil doesn't announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes the monster is the man who smiles while holding a razor to your throat, asking if you'd like a little off the top. And sometimes, for the unlucky few, he doesn't stop at hair. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Velma Barfield Case. A grandmother's hands that rocked cradles also measured poison. She nursed the dying while hiding the truth. She was the one killing them. Tonight, we're chasing a killer who wore kindness like a mask, but beneath her gentle smile lay something far more sinister. A woman who turned care into a weapon, love into a deadly trap, and trust into the final mistake her victims would ever make. Nobody suspected the woman with the soft voice and tender touch. Velma Barfield moved through the small towns of North Carolina like a warm breeze, offering comfort to the sick, companionship to the lonely, and care to the elderly who had no one else. She was the kind of neighbor people prayed for. Attentive, devoted, always ready with a casserole or a kind word. Churches welcomed her. Families trusted her. The vulnerable opened their doors and their hearts to her without hesitation. But evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and rage. Sometimes it arrives with a smile, bearing gifts, whispering reassurances. Sometimes it holds your hand while your body betrays you, while your organs shut down one by one, while confusion clouds your final moments. Velma Barfield understood this better than anyone. She had perfected the art of murder disguised as mercy, death dressed up as devotion. Her story begins not with a single killing, but with a pattern so insidious that it took years for anyone to notice. By the time investigators finally connected the dots, the body count had grown beyond what anyone could have imagined from such an unassuming woman. She wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. She was the person you invited into your home. She was the face you saw before everything went dark. Velma Bullard was born in 1932 in rural South Carolina, the daughter of tobacco farmers who worked land that seemed determined to break them. Poverty defined her childhood. Not the romanticized kind, but the grinding, relentless variety that leaves permanent scars. Her father, Murphy Bullard, was a man whose demons spoke louder than his love. When he drank, which was often, the household transformed into a place of terror. Young Velma learned early that safety was an illusion, that the people meant to protect you could become your worst nightmare. She married young, as many girls did in that era, desperate for escape, hungry for something different. Thomas Burke seemed like her ticket out. They wed when Velma was just 17, two teenagers playing at adulthood without understanding the weight of their vows. The marriage produced 2 children, but little happiness. Thomas worked, drank, and eventually died in a house fire in 1969 under circumstances that raised eyebrows, but not enough suspicion to warrant serious investigation. The official ruling was accidental death. Velma collected the insurance money and moved forward with her life. She remarried within months. Jennings Barfield was her second husband, a widower who thought he'd found companionship in his later years. What he'd actually found was something far more dangerous. Jennings died in 1971, his death attributed to natural causes. Heart failure, the doctors said. He'd been sick after all. These things happen. Velma grieved appropriately, collected another insurance payout, and once again, no one questioned the convenient timing. But Velma had discovered something during these years, something that would define the rest of her murderous career. She developed an addiction to prescription medications, tranquilizers, painkillers, anything that could dull the edges of reality. The drugs cost money, more money than she had. Her solution was both practical and monstrous. She would forge checks, steal from those who trusted her, and when people got too close to discovering her theft, she would eliminate them. Her weapon of choice was arsenic-based rat poison, readily available at any hardware store, easily mixed into food or drinks, and capable of producing symptoms that mimicked natural illness. Victims would experience stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, all things that could be attributed to any number of common ailments, especially in elderly victims. By the time anyone realized something was terribly wrong, Velma would be long gone, already moving on to her next target, her next victim, her next opportunity. The true scope of her crimes began emerging in the mid-1970s when Velma took a position as a live-in caretaker. It was the perfect cover for a serial killer. She had access, opportunity, and built-in explanations for why the people in her care might suddenly decline and die. Who would suspect the devoted nurse tending to their loved ones? Who would question the woman who sat vigil through long nights, who administered medications, who seemed so genuinely concerned? Montgomery and Dolly Edwards were an elderly couple who hired Velma to help care for Dolly, who suffered from various health issues. Within months of Velma's arrival, both were dead. The official causes were listed as natural. After all, they were old and sick. But their deaths followed the same pattern. Sudden onset of severe gastrointestinal distress, rapid deterioration, and death before proper treatment could even begin. Their bodies were never tested for poison. The deaths were simply accepted as tragic but unsurprising losses. Velma didn't kill strangers. She killed people who knew her, trusted her, depended on her. She killed her own mother, Lily Bullard, in 1974. Lily had been staying with Velma, helping out after one of Velma's many supposed illnesses. She died screaming in pain, her body racked with agony that doctors attributed to a sudden illness. Velma held her mother's hand as she died, comforting her, assuring her everything would be fine. It was a lie. Velma knew exactly what was happening because she had caused it. Her own mother, poisoned, dead, all to cover up the theft of a few checks. Record Lee, an elderly man Velma had been dating, died in 1977. His death followed the familiar pattern: sudden illness, agonizing pain, rapid decline. His family mourned him as another victim of old age and poor health. They had no idea that the woman who'd been caring for him, cooking his meals, bringing him comfort, had been slowly poisoning him with rat poison mixed into his food. John Henry Lee, Reckard's nephew and Velma's boyfriend after Reckard's death, would be her final victim. But his death would also be her undoing. When John Henry died in February 1978 after days of excruciating illness, his son insisted on an autopsy. Something didn't feel right. The doctors had been baffled by the symptoms. The progression of the illness didn't match any known disease. And Velma had been there throughout, playing the role of the concerned partner, the devoted nurse. The autopsy revealed massive amounts of arsenic in John Henry's system, levels so high that there was no question about how he died. He'd been murdered, slowly and painfully, over the course of several days. Police immediately focused on the person who'd had the most access to him, who'd prepared his food, who'd been present during his final agonizing hours. They focused on Velma Barfield. When detectives knocked on Velma Barfield's door in March 1978, they found a composed, soft-spoken woman who seemed genuinely shocked by their questions. She invited them in with the practiced hospitality of someone who'd spent years perfecting the mask of normalcy. But investigators had already built a compelling case. They knew about the arsenic. They knew about her access. They knew she was hiding something. Under interrogation, Velma initially maintained her innocence with convincing emotion. She cried appropriately. She expressed horror at the suggestion that John Henry had been poisoned. She played the role of the grieving girlfriend with skill honed through years of deception. But the evidence was overwhelming, and detectives weren't buying her performance. They pressed harder, confronting her with toxicology reports, witness statements, and the undeniable fact that John Henry Lee had died from arsenic poisoning administered by someone close to him. The facade cracked slowly, then all at once. Velma shifted strategies, admitting that yes, she'd given John Henry something, but only to make him sleep. She claimed she'd been trying to help him rest because he'd been so agitated. The poison? She said she'd mixed up some rat poison with his food, just a little bit, thinking it might sedate him. The explanation was absurd. Rat poison isn't a sedative, and the amounts found in John Henry's body couldn't have been accidental or well-intentioned. Detectives kept pushing. They asked about her other victims, about the pattern of deaths that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Velma's composure deteriorated further. She began admitting to more killings, though she framed each one as somehow accidental or justified. Her mother? She claimed Lily had been suffering and Velma was trying to ease her pain. Reckard Lee? She said he'd been verbally abusive and she just wanted him to sleep. The Edwardses? She offered vague justifications about them being sick anyway. What emerged during those interrogation sessions was a portrait of a woman who'd become so comfortable with murder that she'd almost forgotten it was wrong. Velma spoke about poisoning people with the same casual tone someone might use to discuss grocery shopping. She described measuring out rat poison, mixing it into food, watching her victims suffer and die, all without apparent remorse. When confronted with the pain she'd caused, she became defensive, insisting that she'd never meant to actually kill anyone, as if that made the deaths somehow less horrible. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detectives began exhuming bodies of people who died under suspicious circumstances while in Velma's care. Each autopsy revealed the same terrible truth: massive arsenic poisoning. Velma Barfield hadn't just killed John Henry Lee and her mother. She'd been murdering people for years, a serial killer operating openly in plain sight, using her reputation as a caring woman to gain access to victims. Prosecutors built their case around John Henry Lee's murder, selecting it because the evidence was strongest and most recent. But they made sure the jury would hear about the pattern, about the other victims, about Velma's history of theft and deception that had motivated the killings. This wasn't a single crime of passion or a tragic mistake. This was calculated, repeated murder committed by a woman who viewed human life as disposable when it became inconvenient. The trial began in November 1978 in Elizabethtown, North Carolina. The courtroom was packed with people desperate to understand how the woman they'd known, The church-going grandmother, the devoted caretaker, the friendly neighbor, could be a serial killer. Velma's defense team attempted to paint her as a victim herself, a woman damaged by childhood trauma and enslaved by addiction. They argued that her drug dependency had clouded her judgment, that she hadn't fully understood what she was doing when she poisoned her victims. Prosecutors dismantled that defense methodically and brutally. They presented evidence showing that Velma had been functional enough to forge checks, to plan elaborate thefts, to move methodically from victim to victim. They demonstrated that she'd killed not in moments of confusion or diminished capacity, but with clear purpose and planning. She'd researched poisons. She'd carefully measured doses. She'd watched her victims die and then moved seamlessly into the role of the grieving loved one, collecting sympathy and insurance money with equal enthusiasm. Medical experts testified about arsenic poisoning, describing in graphic detail what Velma's victims had endured in their final hours. The poison attacks the gastrointestinal system first, causing violent cramping, uncontrollable vomiting, and diarrhea. As it spreads through the body, it damages organs systematically: liver, kidneys, heart. Victims experience confusion, seizures, and excruciating pain. Death, when it finally comes, is a mercy. John Henry Lee had suffered for days. So had Velma's mother. So had all of them. The prosecution called witnesses who'd seen Velma with her victims during their final illnesses. They described how attentive she'd been, how concerned she'd seemed, how she'd insisted on preparing meals and administering medications herself. None of them had suspected that the woman caring for their loved ones was actually the one killing them. The betrayal cut deep. These were people who'd trusted Velma completely, who'd welcomed her into the most intimate and vulnerable moments of their lives. Velma took the stand in her own defense, a calculated risk that her attorneys hoped would humanize her to the jury. She wept appropriately, describing her difficult childhood, her struggles with addiction, her claims that she'd never intended to kill anyone. She tried to appear sympathetic, broken, worthy of mercy. But under cross-examination, her mask slipped. When pressed about specific details of her crimes, she became evasive and defensive. When confronted with the suffering of her victims, she offered hollow justifications that rang false even as she spoke them. The jury deliberated for less than a day. They found Velma Barfield guilty of first-degree murder in the death of John Henry Lee. The verdict surprised no one. The evidence had been overwhelming, the pattern unmistakable. What remained was the question of punishment. Would North Carolina sentence this grandmother, this church-going woman who'd once baked cookies for neighborhood children, to death? The sentencing phase of Velma Barfield's trial became a referendum on gender, punishment, and the nature of evil itself. Her defense team argued passionately against capital punishment, emphasizing her gender, her age, her supposed remorse. They painted her as an aberration, a broken woman who'd been twisted by circumstances beyond her control. They begged the jury to show mercy, to recognize that executing a grandmother would serve no legitimate purpose. Prosecutors countered with a stark truth. Velma Barfield was a serial killer who'd murdered at least 6 people, possibly more. She'd poisoned her own mother. She'd killed elderly people who'd trusted her with their lives. She'd done all of this not in moments of passion or fear, but coldly and deliberately, motivated by greed and the desire to cover up petty thefts. Her gender didn't make her victims any less dead. Her tears didn't erase the agony she'd inflicted. Justice demanded the ultimate penalty. The jury agreed. On December 2nd, 1978, they sentenced Velma Barfield to death. She would become the first woman sentenced to death in the United States since the Supreme Court reinstated capital punishment in 1976. The decision sparked immediate controversy. Opponents of capital punishment seized on her case, arguing that executing a woman, particularly a grandmother who'd found religion in prison, represented a grotesque miscarriage of justice. Supporters countered that equality meant equal accountability, that women who committed heinous crimes deserved the same punishment as men. Velma was transferred to death row at North Carolina's Central Prison, where she would spend the next 6 years fighting for her life through endless appeals. During this time, she underwent what many claimed was a genuine religious conversion. She became a devout Christian, reading the Bible constantly, counseling other inmates, and expressing remorse for her crimes. Prison officials and religious advisors who worked with her believed her transformation was real. She wrote letters to the families of her victims, begging forgiveness. She participated in prison ministry programs. She became, by all accounts, a model prisoner. But the families of her victims saw this supposed transformation differently. They watched as Velma became a cause célèbre for anti-death penalty activists, as her story was sanitized and repackaged as a tale of redemption. They listened to supporters describe her as a victim of circumstance who deserved mercy. And they remembered what she'd done to their loved ones. They remembered the pain, the betrayal, the lies. No amount of Bible reading could undo the murders. No tears could bring back the dead. The legal appeals stretched on year after year. Velma's attorneys challenged every aspect of her conviction and sentence, filing motion after motion in state and federal courts. They argued that her trial had been unfair, that the jury had been improperly instructed, that new evidence had emerged. Each appeal was denied. Each court that reviewed her case concluded that her conviction was sound, her sentence appropriate. The legal system might move slowly, but it was moving toward an inevitable conclusion. Public opinion remained deeply divided. Religious leaders, including prominent evangelicals, pleaded for clemency. They argued that Velma's transformation proved the possibility of redemption, that executing her would serve no purpose beyond vengeance. Mental health advocates pointed to her history of abuse and addiction, suggesting that she deserved treatment rather than execution. Women's groups expressed concern about the precedent of executing a woman when so few women received death sentences compared to men. But others pushed back forcefully. Victims' rights advocates argued that Velma's crimes were particularly heinous precisely because she'd exploited trust and violated the most fundamental human bonds. She'd murdered her own mother. She'd killed elderly people who'd depended on her for care. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence, but calculated murders committed over extended periods. The suffering she'd inflicted on her victims and their families couldn't be erased by convenient jailhouse conversion. Governor James Hunt of North Carolina faced enormous pressure from both sides as Velma's execution date approached. He received thousands of letters, both pleading for mercy and demanding justice. Religious leaders visited him personally, urging clemency. Victims' families wrote to him describing their pain and their desire to see justice done. Hunt was himself deeply religious and personally opposed to capital punishment in many cases, but he also believed that some crimes demanded the ultimate penalty. Throughout all of this, Velma maintained her newfound religious devotion while continuing to downplay the full horror of her crimes. In interviews with journalists and authors, she described herself as someone who'd made terrible mistakes but who deserved forgiveness. She spoke about her childhood trauma and her addiction as if they somehow excused or explained serial murder. She cried frequently and convincingly, performing contrition with the same skill she'd once used to perform innocence. Billy Graham, one of the most famous religious leaders in America, intervened on Velma's behalf. He wrote to Governor Hunt, arguing that her conversion was genuine and that executing her would serve no legitimate purpose. Graham's involvement brought even more attention to the case, turning Velma's execution into a national debate about punishment, redemption, and gender. Death penalty opponents used her case to argue against capital punishment generally. Supporters used it to demonstrate that justice should be blind to gender. As her execution date in 1984 approached, Velma's supporters grew more desperate. They organized vigils, held prayer services, and launched media campaigns portraying her as a reformed sinner who deserved life. They emphasized her work with other inmates, her religious devotion, her expressions of remorse. They argued that she'd become a different person than the woman who'd committed those murders, that executing her would be killing someone who no longer existed. Governor Hunt wrestled with the decision privately. He reviewed the case file extensively, studying the details of Velma's crimes and the suffering of her victims. He met with victims' families, who begged him not to grant clemency. He consulted with religious advisors and legal experts. In the end, He concluded that while he respected those who opposed the death penalty, Velma Barfield's crimes were so serious, so calculated, and so numerous that execution was appropriate. He denied clemency. The final weeks of Velma's life were filled with prayer, interviews, and continued legal maneuvering. Her attorneys filed last-minute appeals that were quickly denied. Supporters held vigils outside the prison. Victims' families prepared for what they hoped would be closure, though many privately doubted whether they'd ever find peace. Velma herself maintained her composure, insisting that she'd accepted her fate and was ready to face her maker. On November 2nd, 1984, Velma Barfield's final appeals were exhausted. The execution was scheduled for that very night. She spent her last day visiting with her children, who'd stood by her despite everything. She spoke with religious advisors who'd worked with her during her years on death row. She wrote final letters expressing remorse and love. And she prepared to become the first woman executed in the United States in 22 years. As darkness fell over Central Prison on November 2nd, 1984, protesters gathered outside the gates. Some held candles and signs opposing capital punishment, singing hymns and praying for Velma's life to be spared. Others stood silently, representing victims' families, there to bear witness to justice finally being served. The media presence was massive. Dozens of reporters and camera crews documenting every moment of this historic execution. Inside the prison, Velma Barfield prepared for death with remarkable composure. She'd requested a final meal of cheese doodles and Coca-Cola, a strangely mundane choice for someone's last taste of earthly pleasure. She spent time with the prison chaplain, praying and reading scripture. She spoke calmly with guards who'd come to know her during her years on death row. Some of them wept openly, having formed attachments to this grandmother who seemed so different from the monster she'd once been. The execution chamber had been prepared meticulously. North Carolina had recently switched from the gas chamber to lethal injection, a method considered more humane. Velma would be the first person executed by this method in the state. The gurney waited, stark and clinical, surrounded by medical equipment that would deliver the 3-drug cocktail designed to stop her heart. Witnesses began filing into the observation room. Journalists, state officials, and representatives of victims' families. Velma was escorted into the chamber at approximately 2 a.m. She wore a pink outfit she'd selected herself, her makeup carefully applied, her manner calm. Guards strapped her to the gurney with practiced efficiency, while medical personnel began preparing the intravenous lines that would deliver the lethal drugs. Through the glass, witnesses watched this surreal scene. A grandmother being prepared for execution like a patient being prepped for surgery. She was offered a chance to make a final statement. Velma accepted, speaking in a steady voice that carried clearly through the observation window. She expressed remorse for her crimes, asked forgiveness from the families of her victims, and proclaimed her faith in Jesus Christ. She didn't try to excuse what she'd done or minimize the pain she'd caused. She simply said she was sorry and that she was ready to face judgment. Some witnesses found her words moving. Others saw them as a final manipulation from a woman who'd spent her life lying. The warden asked if she had any last words beyond her statement. Velma looked toward the observation window, toward the faces watching her die, and said simply, "I want to say I'm sorry to all the families I've hurt. I'm sorry for what I've done. I know my death won't bring back their loved ones, but I hope it brings them some peace." Her voice remained steady. Her eyes were clear. She seemed almost eager for it to be over. At 2:15 a.m., the executioner began the procedure. The first drug, sodium thiopental, flowed into Velma's veins, a barbiturate designed to render her unconscious within seconds. Her eyes fluttered, then closed. Her breathing slowed but continued. The second drug, pancuronium bromide, followed, a paralytic that would stop her breathing. Witnesses watched as her chest stopped rising, as her body went completely still. The final drug, potassium chloride, would stop her heart, ending her life. Medical personnel monitored her vital signs, watching for the flat line that would signal death. Minutes passed in heavy silence. The witnesses sat motionless, some with tears streaming down their faces, others staring with grim satisfaction. Outside, protesters continued their vigil, unaware that inside the prison walls, Velma Barfield was already gone. At 2:24 a.m. on November 2nd, 1984, Velma Barfield was pronounced dead. She'd become the first woman executed in the United States since 1962, and the first person ever executed by lethal injection in North Carolina. Her death marked a significant moment in the history of capital punishment, proving that gender would not shield even grandmothers from the ultimate penalty if their crimes warranted it. The families of her victims received word that justice had been served. For some, it brought a measure of closure they'd been seeking since discovering how their loved ones had really died. Others found that execution provided no relief from their grief and anger. Velma's death couldn't undo the murders or erase the betrayal. Their family members were still gone, still victims of a trusted friend who'd poisoned them for money and convenience. Velma's own family grieved differently. Her children had stood by her throughout the legal proceedings, believing in her redemption and arguing against her execution. They now mourned a mother who'd been both victim and perpetrator, damaged by her own childhood while inflicting damage on others. The complexity of loving someone who'd done terrible things weighed heavily on them. They arranged for her burial in a quiet ceremony away from media attention. Death penalty opponents used Velma's execution to fuel their arguments against capital punishment, particularly the execution of women. They pointed to her transformation in prison, her religious conversion, her work with other inmates. They argued that she'd proven the possibility of redemption and that her execution served no purpose beyond vengeance. Some made the case that her gender and grandmother status should have entitled her to mercy, though this argument was controversial even among anti-death penalty activists. Supporters of capital punishment viewed the case differently. They saw Velma Barfield as proof that justice could be genderblind, that women who committed heinous crimes would face the same consequences as men. They rejected the notion that her jailhouse conversion or her tears should erase her responsibility for multiple murders. Justice, they argued, had been served appropriately and proportionately to her crimes. The true legacy of Velma Barfield extends beyond the death penalty debate. Her case revealed how easily a serial killer can operate when they choose victims society considers expendable: the elderly, the sick, those without strong family connections to advocate for them. She exposed the vulnerability of people who trusted caregivers with their lives. She demonstrated that monsters don't always look like monsters, that they can appear as friendly neighbors, devoted nurses, loving family members. Investigators believe Velma Barfield may have killed more people than she ever admitted. The 6 confirmed victims, her mother Lily Bullard, her second husband Jennings Barfield, Dolly and Montgomery Edwards, Record Lee, and John Henry Lee, represented only the deaths that could be proven. But Velma had worked as a caretaker for years, had access to dozens of elderly and vulnerable people, and had both the means and the motive to kill more. The first husband who died in that convenient fire, the various employers and acquaintances who died suddenly while in her care, all of these raised questions that would never be answered. Her methods had been frighteningly simple. Rat poison was cheap and readily available. The symptoms mimicked natural illness. Elderly victims were expected to die eventually anyway, so their deaths rarely triggered suspicion. Velma had understood that if you chose your victims carefully and killed them slowly enough, you could literally get away with murder for years. Only John Henry Lee's son's insistence on an autopsy had finally exposed her crimes. The case changed how caregivers were viewed and monitored in North Carolina and beyond. It prompted new protocols for investigating deaths of elderly people under care, new awareness of the signs of poisoning, and new skepticism about assuming that deaths in elderly populations were always natural. Velma Barfield had forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth. The people we trust most to care for vulnerable populations have the greatest opportunity to harm them. Years after her execution, people still debate whether Velma Barfield was a monster or a damaged woman who became a monster. They argue about whether her religious conversion was genuine or calculated. They discuss whether executing her served justice or merely satisfied vengeance. But while these debates continue, one truth remains unchallenged. Velma Barfield murdered at least 6 people through deliberate poisoning, causing agonizing deaths to people who trusted her completely. The woman who'd once rocked babies in her arms had measured poison with the same hands. The grandmother who'd baked cookies had stirred arsenic into meals. The nurse who'd comforted the dying had been the one killing them. Velma Barfield proved that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and rage. Sometimes it arrives with a gentle smile, offering care and comfort, whispering reassurances even as it measures out death one careful dose at a time. Her story serves as a permanent reminder that the monsters we fear aren't always the strangers in shadows. Sometimes they're the people we invite into our homes, the ones we trust with our lives, the faces we see in our final moments, and that makes them far more terrifying than any nightmare we could imagine. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Predator Who Wore a Badge. Some devils don't lurk in shadows. They hide behind the very laws meant to protect us. When trust becomes a weapon, nowhere is safe. Tonight, we're hunting the truth about a man who should have been a guardian but became something far more sinister. A predator who weaponized his authority, turning protection into predation. This is the story of James Antonio Barnes, and I promise you, the monster behind the badge was far worse than anyone imagined. Antonio Barnes understood power long before he ever pinned a badge to his chest. He understood that certain positions grant access, that authority opens doors most people can only dream of crossing, and that trust, real, genuine trust, is the most dangerous weapon a predator can wield. When Barnes joined law enforcement, he didn't do it to serve and protect. He did it to hunt. The streets of Memphis, Tennessee, knew violence. They knew corruption. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that one of their own sworn officers was orchestrating a nightmare that would shatter lives and expose the darkest cracks in a system designed to keep people safe. Barnes wasn't just breaking the law. He was perverting every oath he'd ever taken, transforming his position of authority into a hunting ground. Let me take you back to where this horror story truly begins, not with his arrest, not with his exposure, but with the calculated, methodical way he built his empire of exploitation. Barnes worked as a detention officer, a position that placed him in direct contact with some of society's most vulnerable individuals, people already trapped within the criminal justice system, people with records, with pasts, with limited options, and even fewer advocates. He saw opportunity where others saw duty. His crimes weren't impulsive. They weren't crimes of passion or momentary weakness. Barnes operated with the precision of someone who had carefully studied his prey, who understood exactly which victims would be believed and which wouldn't, who knew how to leverage his authority like a knife pressed against someone's throat without ever leaving a visible mark. He identified women with criminal histories, women who had children, women who understood that challenging a law enforcement officer could mean losing everything they loved. The manipulation began subtly. A favor here, a warning there, information about their cases that technically shouldn't have been shared. Barnes would position himself as someone on their side, someone who could help navigate the treacherous waters of the justice system, for a price that had nothing to do with money. He wasn't interested in cash. His currency was far more sinister. He demanded access to their bodies, to their dignity, to their humanity. And when they refused, he reminded them exactly who wore the badge and who didn't. One victim, let's call her Sarah, though that's not her real name, later described the sickening realization that she was trapped. Barnes had approached her after her arrest, offering to smooth things over with prosecutors, suggesting he had connections that could make her charges disappear or at least become more manageable. She was a mother. She had 2 young children at home. The thought of prison time, of losing custody, of her babies growing up without her, it paralyzed her with terror. Barnes knew this. He fed on this fear like a parasite. When Sarah refused his initial advances, Barnes shifted tactics with frightening speed. Suddenly, her court dates became confused. Evidence that should have supported her case mysteriously went missing from reports. Officers who had been cordial became cold, distant. The message was clear without ever being spoken directly. Comply or suffer consequences that would destroy everything you're fighting for. This wasn't seduction. This wasn't even coercion in the traditional sense. This was psychological warfare waged by someone who understood exactly how much power he held and how little his victims possessed. But Sarah wasn't his only target. Barnes had refined his hunting technique over time, and his victim count climbed steadily. Each woman represented another life violated, another trust betrayed, another soul scarred by someone who should have represented justice. Some were pressured during booking procedures. Others were targeted when they came to the detention facility to visit loved ones. Barnes had access to their personal information, their criminal histories, their vulnerabilities. He studied them like a predator studies wounded prey, identifying which ones were already struggling, already fighting systems that seemed designed to crush them. The truly horrifying aspect of Barnes's crimes wasn't just the sexual violence itself, though that alone would be monstrous enough. It was the systematic way he dismantled their ability to fight back or seek help. Who would believe a woman with a criminal record over a sworn law enforcement officer? Who would take seriously accusations from someone already entangled in the justice system against someone meant to uphold it? Barnes gambled on silence, on shame, on the realistic calculation that his victims understood they were powerless. He was right for a while. The detention facility where Barnes worked should have been a place of basic human dignity, even for those who'd broken laws. Instead, it became a hunting ground where someone entrusted with authority used that power as permission for unspeakable violations. His fellow officers noticed nothing, or perhaps noticed and said nothing, a distinction that haunts the investigation to this day. How many opportunities were there to stop him? How many red flags were ignored? How many complaints were dismissed because they came from unreliable sources? Barnes moved through his shifts with confidence bordering on arrogance. He had cracked the code of predatory behavior in institutional settings. Target the vulnerable, exploit systemic failures, and hide behind the authority that most people instinctively trust. Every shift became an opportunity. Every interaction with someone in custody became potential leverage. His crimes occurred not in dark alleys or abandoned buildings, but within the walls of a government facility, under fluorescent lights, surrounded by other officers and security systems that somehow failed to protect the very people they confined. The psychological damage Barnes inflicted extended far beyond the physical violations. His victims carried the weight of trauma, compounded by hopelessness. The devastating knowledge that the system meant to protect them had instead produced their abuser. Some stopped fighting their cases, accepting plea deals they shouldn't have accepted because fighting meant continued contact with a system where Barnes operated freely. Others suffered in silence. Their trust in authority figures shattered so completely that seeking help from other law enforcement seemed impossible, even cruel. Barnes represented something more terrifying than a random predator on the streets. He represented systemic failure, the corruption of power, and the weaponization of authority against those with the fewest defenses. He proved that monsters don't always lurk in shadows. Sometimes they wear badges, carry weapons sanctioned by the state, and operate with the assumption that their position grants immunity from consequences. But every predator makes mistakes. Every hunting ground eventually becomes a crime scene, and Barnes's carefully constructed empire of exploitation was about to crumble in ways he never anticipated, brought down not by the system that should have stopped him years earlier, but by the courage of victims who refused to remain silent any longer. The first crack in James Antonio Barnes's armor came from an unexpected source, a victim who decided that surviving wasn't enough anymore. She wanted justice, even if justice meant risking everything she'd already fought to protect. Let's call her Diana. Her story would become the catalyst that finally exposed the full scope of Barnes's predatory campaign. Diana had been arrested on drug-related charges, a consequence of addiction struggles that had dominated her adult life. She wasn't proud of her choices, but she was trying, attending court-mandated programs, working toward sobriety, fighting to maintain custody of her 7-year-old daughter. When Barnes first approached her during processing at the detention facility, She recognized the look in his eyes immediately. She'd seen that expression before, on the faces of men who viewed her addiction and criminal record as evidence that her consent didn't matter, that her body was negotiable currency. Barnes offered his standard package of implied threats and false promises. He suggested that cooperation would benefit her case. He mentioned that prosecutors often consulted with detention officers about inmate behavior and attitudes. He painted a picture where resistance meant harder consequences and compliance meant smoother paths through the legal system. Diana refused. She knew what he was really asking for, and despite everything she'd lost to addiction and poor decisions, she wasn't willing to surrender her dignity to a corrupt officer. The retaliation was swift and brutal. Within days, Diana found herself subjected to unnecessary strip searches, placed in solitary confinement for minor infractions that other inmates committed without consequence, and denied access to addiction counseling programs that were critical to her treatment plan. Barnes orchestrated her suffering with casual cruelty, demonstrating exactly how much power he wielded and how little protection she had. The message was clear: this suffering continues until you give me what I want. But Diana had something Barnes hadn't anticipated: a support system that refused to abandon her. Her sister, a paralegal with enough legal knowledge to recognize that what was happening wasn't standard procedure, began documenting everything. Every denied phone call, every suspicious incident report, every deviation from normal detention facility protocols. She didn't know exactly what Barnes was doing, but she knew something was desperately wrong. Her documentation would later become crucial evidence, a paper trail that corroborated Diana's eventual testimony. When Diana was finally released on bond, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of accepting her suffering as the price of survival, instead of moving forward and trying to forget, she contacted an attorney who specialized in civil rights violations. The attorney, a woman named Margaret Chen who'd spent her career fighting institutional abuse, listened to Diana's story with growing horror and recognition. This wasn't an isolated incident. The patterns Diana described, the targeting of vulnerable women, the use of authority as coercion, the systematic retaliation against those who refused, suggested something far more organized than a single bad interaction. Chun began investigating quietly, carefully. She knew that accusing a law enforcement officer without ironclad evidence could backfire catastrophically, destroying her client's credibility and potentially exposing Diana to even more retaliation. She started by filing public records requests for complaint histories, disciplinary records, and incident reports from the detention facility. Most came back heavily redacted or were denied entirely under exemptions for ongoing investigations or personnel privacy. But Chun was persistent, and her persistence revealed something interesting. There were ongoing investigations, plural, related to Barnes's conduct. Meanwhile, other victims were beginning to find their voices. A woman who'd been targeted by Barnes 2 years earlier saw a local news story about Diana's lawsuit and recognized the name. She contacted Chen's office, sharing her own story of coercion and abuse. Then another victim came forward, and another. Each woman described similar tactics, similar threats, similar violations. Barnes had been operating this way for years, leaving a trail of traumatized victims who'd been too afraid or too hopeless to report him. The pattern was undeniable. Barnes specifically targeted women with children, women facing serious charges, women whose criminal histories made them easy to discredit. He offered help that came with devastating conditions. He retaliated against refusal with bureaucratic cruelty that left no obvious fingerprints. And he operated with apparent impunity within an institution that should have had multiple safeguards against exactly this kind of predatory behavior. Chun brought her evidence to the FBI. She knew that local prosecutors might face conflicts of interest when investigating law enforcement officers they worked alongside regularly. Federal authorities could provide the distance and resources necessary for a legitimate investigation. The FBI agent assigned to the case, a veteran investigator named Marcus Holland who specialized in public corruption, recognized immediately that this wasn't just a case of sexual misconduct. It was a civil rights violation under color of law, a federal crime that carried serious penalties. Holland began building a case with meticulous care. He interviewed each victim multiple times, corroborating their stories and identifying patterns. He subpoenaed records from the detention facility, discovering that Barnes had accessed files for women he had no legitimate reason to be reviewing. He obtained surveillance footage that showed Barnes isolating victims in areas without camera coverage. He traced Barnes's work schedule against incident reports, demonstrating suspicious correlations between his shifts and disciplinary actions against women who'd later accused him. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Holland needed witnesses willing to testify, and that requirement created an agonizing dilemma for the victims. Coming forward meant publicly reliving their trauma. It meant subjecting themselves to cross-examination by defense attorneys who would absolutely attack their credibility, their criminal histories, their character. It meant facing potential retaliation from Barnes's allies within law enforcement. It meant risking custody of their children if their cases were still pending. The cost of justice was almost unbearably high. Diana decided to testify. So did 3 other women, each making the excruciating choice to sacrifice their privacy and potentially their safety for accountability. They understood that remaining silent protected Barnes, allowing him to continue hunting new victims. They understood that their voices, combined and corroborated, carried power that individual accusations never could. They understood that this was their chance, maybe their only chance, to transform their suffering into something meaningful. The federal indictment against James Antonio Barnes was unsealed on a Wednesday morning in March. He was charged with multiple counts of civil rights violations, specifically depriving individuals of their constitutional rights through sexual assault while acting under color of law. Each count carried a potential sentence of life in prison. The indictment detailed a pattern of predatory behavior spanning at least 5 years, affecting at least 13 identified victims, with strong suspicion of many more who never came forward. Barnes was arrested at his home, the same home where he'd returned after shifts spent violating the people placed under his supervision. His perp walk became local news, his face, once hidden behind authority and institutional protection, suddenly exposed to the same scrutiny and judgment he'd escaped for so long. His booking photo showed a man who seemed genuinely shocked that consequences had finally arrived, as if he truly believed his position granted permanent immunity. The law enforcement community's response revealed uncomfortable truths about institutional culture. Some officers expressed shock and condemned Barnes immediately. Others remained conspicuously silent. A few suggested that the accusations were exaggerated, that Barnes was being targeted because criminals needed someone to blame for their own failures. This victim blaming extended even to pretrial hearings, where Barnes's defense attorney argued that his accusers were unreliable witnesses with motivations to fabricate complaints. But the evidence was overwhelming. Too many victims with too many consistent details, too much corroborating documentation, too many witnesses who'd observed Barnes's behavior and said nothing at the time but were willing to testify now. The monster who'd hidden behind a badge was finally exposed, dragged into light that revealed every scar he'd left on the people he'd sworn to protect. The case against Barnes represented more than one corrupt officer's prosecution. It represented a reckoning with systems that enabled predators, with cultures that protected bad actors, with hierarchies that valued institutional reputation over victim safety. Every victim who testified wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every person who'd been violated by someone in authority and told that seeking justice was pointless. Diana, the woman who'd first broken her silence, later described the moment she finished her testimony. She'd expected to feel relief or vindication, but instead she felt something simpler and more profound. She felt believed. After years of being dismissed, discredited, and devalued, someone with power had finally listened, really listened, and declared that what happened to her mattered. That Barnes was wrong, that she deserved protection, dignity, and justice. The trial was approaching, and Barnes faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. But beyond the courtroom drama, beyond the legal proceedings and evidence presentations, something more fundamental was happening. Victims who'd been silenced were finding their voices. Systems that had failed were being forced to confront their failures. And a community was beginning to understand that predators don't always wear masks. Sometimes they wear uniforms. The federal courthouse in Memphis became ground zero for a reckoning that transcended one man's crimes. James Antonio Barnes's trial wasn't just about holding a corrupt detention officer accountable. It was about examining the systemic rot that had allowed him to operate freely for years, destroying lives while his colleagues noticed nothing or chose to see nothing. Jury selection revealed America's complicated relationship with law enforcement. Potential jurors who'd had negative experiences with police were dismissed by the prosecution, concerned they'd bring bias against the institution. Those who expressed unwavering faith in law enforcement were dismissed by the defense, concerned they'd be unable to believe an officer could commit such crimes. What remained was a jury of 12 people tasked with determining whether the man sitting at the defense table, dressed in a suit, clean-shaven, looking every bit the professional officer, was actually the monster described in the indictment. Lead prosecutor Amanda Reeves opened with a statement designed to shatter any presumption of innocence Barnes might claim through his former profession. She didn't ease into her argument. She struck immediately and viciously, describing Barnes not as a rogue officer but as a sexual predator who weaponized his badge, transforming a detention facility into his personal hunting ground where vulnerable women became prey and authority became permission for unspeakable violence. Reeves laid out the prosecution's theory with devastating clarity. Barnes had systematically identified women in desperate circumstances, facing serious charges, fighting for custody of children, struggling with addiction, and exploited their vulnerability with calculated precision. He offered help that came with conditions no human should ever be forced to accept. When victims refused, he retaliated through official channels, using his position to make their legal situations worse, to deny them services, to punish them bureaucratically until compliance seemed like the only survivable option. The first victim to testify was Diana, the woman whose courage had initiated the entire investigation. She walked to the witness stand with visible tension, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. Reeves guided her through her testimony with careful respect, establishing Diana's background without dwelling unnecessarily on her struggles with addiction or her criminal history. Then came the moment Diana had been dreading, describing what Barnes had done. Her voice didn't break. She didn't cry or show the emotional devastation defense attorneys often exploit to suggest unreliable testimony. Instead, Diana spoke with calm, factual precision about the day Barnes approached her during booking, about his offers and threats, about the retaliation she experienced when she refused, about the systematic way he tried to break her spirit until she either complied or gave up entirely. The jury watched her with focused attention, several members taking extensive notes. Cross-examination was brutal, exactly as Diana had expected. Barnes's defense attorney, a seasoned litigator named Robert Mitchum who specialized in defending law enforcement officers, attacked Diana's credibility relentlessly. He highlighted her drug conviction, her history of lying to family members about her addiction, her plea agreement in another case that involved providing testimony against co-defendants. He suggested that Diana had fabricated the accusations to gain leverage in her own legal troubles, that she'd coordinated with other inmates to create a conspiracy against Barnes, that her testimony was motivated by revenge rather than truth. But Mitchum made a critical mistake. He pushed too hard, his cross-examination crossing from vigorous defense into victim blaming that repulsed several jurors. When he suggested that Diana's refusal to report Barnes immediately proved nothing had really happened, she responded with devastating simplicity, "Who would believe me? Who would believe a drug addict with a criminal record over a detention officer? You're proving my point right now. You don't believe me. Why would I have thought anyone else would?" The courtroom went silent. Mitchum had no effective response. He'd walked directly into demonstrating the exact power imbalance and credibility gap that Barnes had exploited. 3 more victims testified over the following days. Each described similar patterns: the targeting, the coercion, the retaliation. Each withstood cross-examination that attacked their character, their histories, their motivations. And each time, the cumulative weight of their testimonies grew heavier, the patterns more undeniable. These weren't fabricated stories. These were consistent accounts from different women describing the same predatory tactics employed by the same corrupt officer. The prosecution then presented its documentary evidence. Agent Holland testified about Barnes's computer access logs, showing that he'd reviewed files for women he had no official reason to be monitoring. He presented surveillance footage showing Barnes isolating victims in areas without camera coverage. He introduced disciplinary reports that showed suspicious patterns. Women who'd accused Barnes faced dramatically higher rates of violations and punishments than the general detention population. An expert on sexual assault and institutional predators testified about grooming behavior and how predators select victims. She explained how Barnes's tactics fit classical patterns. Identifying vulnerable targets, establishing a relationship that appears helpful, gradually introducing sexual demands while emphasizing the target's dependence and limited options, then punishing resistance while rewarding compliance. Barnes, she testified, was a textbook example of an institutional predator, someone who'd carefully studied how to exploit both his victims and the system meant to constrain him. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from Barnes's former colleagues. Several detention officers testified reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable admitting they'd witnessed red flags but failed to report them or investigate further. One officer described seeing Barnes spending unusual amounts of time with female detainees in private areas. Another testified about complaints from women that Barnes had made inappropriate comments or requests, complaints that were documented but never seriously investigated. A supervisor admitted that Barnes had been informally warned about boundary violations, but formal discipline was never imposed because the complaints came from unreliable sources. Code for people with criminal records. The institutional failure was breathtaking. Multiple people had noticed Barnes's behavior. Multiple complaints had been filed. And yet the system had protected him, prioritizing his reputation and the facility's image over the safety of people under their supervision. The culture had presumed that detained individuals were lying and that officers should be believed, creating an environment where predators like Barnes could operate virtually unchallenged. The defense case was predictably weak. Mitchum called character witnesses who testified that Barnes was a good officer, a dedicated professional, someone who'd never shown predatory tendencies in their presence. He presented evidence that some of the victims had complained about other officers too, suggesting a pattern of false accusations rather than Barnes's guilt. He argued that consensual sexual relationships between detention staff and people in custody, while inappropriate and against policy, weren't criminal, a legal argument that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. Barnes didn't testify. His attorneys couldn't risk putting him on the stand where he'd face cross-examination about each victim's accusations. Instead, he sat silently throughout the trial, occasionally shaking his head or showing expressions of disbelief, performing innocence for the jury's benefit. Closing arguments transformed the courtroom into a philosophical battleground about power, authority, and justice. Reeves argued that Barnes represented the ultimate betrayal, a person entrusted with authority who used that power to victimize the vulnerable. She reminded jurors that the badge Barnes wore wasn't a shield protecting him from accountability. It was evidence of why his crimes were so heinous. He'd violated not just his victims, but every principle law enforcement supposedly stood for. Mitchum's closing attempted to reframe the entire case as a conspiracy by criminals to destroy a good officer. He argued that the government had failed to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt, that the victims' testimonies were inconsistent on minor details, that the documentary evidence was circumstantial. He appealed to jurors' presumed respect for law enforcement, suggesting that convicting Barnes would discourage good people from becoming officers. The jury deliberated for 4 days, longer than prosecutors had hoped, but not unexpected given the case's complexity and the cultural weight of convicting a law enforcement officer. When they finally returned, the verdict was read in a courtroom packed with victims, their supporters, reporters, and law enforcement officers from multiple agencies, watching to see whether the system would finally hold one of their own accountable. Guilty, on every count. 13 separate convictions for civil rights violations through sexual assault under color of law. Barnes showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, maintaining the same blank expression he'd worn throughout the trial. But in the gallery, Diana broke down crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being believed, of having her truth validated by 12 strangers who'd chosen justice over institutional protection. The judge remanded Barnes to custody immediately, denying bail pending sentencing. As federal marshals led him from the courtroom in handcuffs, the same hands that had once wielded authority as a weapon were now restrained. The same man who'd worn a badge as permission for predation was now dressed in the same detention clothing his victims had worn when he'd violated them. Justice had arrived, delayed and insufficient to undo the harm Barnes had caused, but arrived nonetheless. And in that arrival, there was a message. Authority doesn't grant immunity, badges don't justify abuse, and systems that protect predators will eventually face reckoning. The months between James Antonio Barnes's conviction and his sentencing hearing stretched like a wound refusing to heal. His victims waited, suspended between the validation of the guilty verdicts and the uncertainty of whether the punishment would match the magnitude of his crimes. Federal sentencing guidelines suggested a possible life sentence, but guidelines are recommendations, not requirements, and judges maintain discretion that can transform justice into disappointment with the stroke of a pen. The pre-sentencing investigation revealed details that made Barnes's crimes even more disturbing. Federal investigators discovered that Barnes's predatory behavior dated back further than the 5-year period covered in the indictment. They identified at least 7 additional victims who'd been violated but were either too afraid to testify or couldn't be located to participate in the trial. One woman had died of a drug overdose 2 years before Barnes's arrest. Her sister provided a journal where the victim had written extensively about being sexually assaulted by a detention officer who matched Barnes's description. She'd never reported it because she'd been convinced no one would believe her. Psychologists who evaluated Barnes for the pre-sentencing report described him as exhibiting narcissistic personality traits with sociopathic tendencies. He showed no genuine remorse for his actions, only frustration at being caught. In interviews, he consistently minimized his behavior, suggesting that his victims had exaggerated or misunderstood situations that he characterized as consensual or misinterpreted. He blamed the women for putting themselves in vulnerable positions through their criminal behavior. He even suggested that he was the real victim, a dedicated officer whose career had been destroyed by vindictive criminals and an overzealous prosecution. This absence of remorse would become critical at sentencing. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in August, nearly 6 months after the conviction. The courtroom filled early with victims, family members, reporters, and curious observers drawn by the case's notoriety. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison, a 63-year-old jurist known for her careful deliberation and her refusal to show leniency to criminals who abused positions of trust, presided with stern dignity. Federal sentencing hearings allow victims to present impact statements directly to the court, giving them an opportunity to describe how the defendant's crimes affected their lives. Diana was the first to speak. She stood at the podium, facing Judge Morrison rather than Barnes, and delivered a statement that captured the compounded trauma of being violated by someone meant to protect her. She described the nightmares that still woke her in sweating terror. She talked about her inability to trust authority figures, how she now panicked during routine traffic stops or any interaction with law enforcement. She explained how Barnes had stolen not just her dignity, but her faith in justice itself, leaving her to navigate life with the constant fear that power and predation are synonymous. She described attending therapy 3 times a week, struggling with PTSD that made normal life feel impossible. And she described the courage it took to come forward, knowing she'd be attacked and disbelieved, choosing justice over self-protection. "You didn't just assault me," Diana said, her voice steady but laced with anger. "You taught me that the people who claim to protect us are sometimes the most dangerous. You used your authority like a weapon, and every day I still feel the wounds you left. I want you to know that your crimes didn't break me. I'm still here. I'm still fighting. And I'm speaking so that every person you hurt knows they're not alone, and so that every predator wearing a badge knows they will eventually face consequences." Judge Morrison listened without expression, taking notes occasionally, her attention completely focused on Diana's testimony. 3 other victims spoke, each describing similar psychological devastation. One woman explained how Barnes's actions had contributed to a relapse into drug use that cost her custody of her children for 2 years. Another described attempting suicide 3 months after Barnes assaulted her. convinced that her life had no value and that justice was impossible. A third simply read the names of her two young daughters and said, "Every time I look at them, I remember what I had to endure to stay in their lives, and I hate that James Barnes still breathes the same air as my children." The emotional weight in the courtroom was suffocating. Several jurors from the trial had returned to watch the sentencing, and more than one cried openly while listening to the victim statements. Prosecutor Amanda Reeves then presented the government's sentencing recommendation: life imprisonment without possibility of parole. She argued that Barnes's crimes represented some of the most egregious civil rights violations imaginable. A law enforcement officer systematically targeting vulnerable women, using his authority to coerce sexual acts, and showing absolutely no remorse for the suffering he'd caused. She emphasized that Barnes had violated not just his victims but the public trust, corrupting an institution that communities depend upon for safety and justice. Defense attorney Robert Mitchum presented a starkly different narrative. He acknowledged that Barnes had been convicted and wouldn't contest the jury's verdict, but argued for a sentence of 20 years, suggesting that life imprisonment was disproportionate. He presented letters from Barnes's family members describing him as a devoted father and husband. He highlighted Barnes's military service and his years of otherwise unremarkable work in law enforcement. He suggested that Barnes was struggling with mental health issues and alcohol abuse that had contributed to his poor judgment. And he argued that Barnes still had potential for rehabilitation, that he wasn't beyond redemption. It was a standard defense mitigation strategy. Humanize the defendant, suggest external factors contributed to the crimes, argue that even serious wrongdoing doesn't make someone irredeemable. But in this courtroom, after everything the victims had described, it rang hollow and almost offensive. Judge Morrison then asked Barnes if he wished to speak. Barnes stood, looking directly at the judge rather than at his victims. His statement was brief and carefully crafted, clearly scripted by his attorneys. He expressed regret for his actions and acknowledged that he'd violated his oath as a law enforcement officer. He said he understood the pain he'd caused and wished he could undo his mistakes. He asked for mercy, citing his family and his years of otherwise honorable service. What Barnes didn't do was apologize directly to his victims. He didn't acknowledge the systematic nature of his predation. He didn't show any deep understanding of why his crimes were so devastating. His statement was performative remorse, designed to potentially reduce his sentence, lacking any genuine emotional accountability. Judge Morrison had heard enough. She took a brief recess to review her notes, then returned to deliver a sentence that would define Barnes's legacy and send a message about accountability for law enforcement officers who abused their authority. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, systematically dismantling any argument for leniency. She noted that Barnes hadn't committed crimes of passion or momentary weakness, but had engaged in calculated, systematic predation spanning years. She emphasized that he'd specifically targeted the most vulnerable members of society, women already trapped in the criminal justice system, women with limited resources and even less credibility, women who Barnes believed would never be believed over a sworn officer. Judge Morrison then addressed something that had troubled her throughout the trial: the institutional failure that had enabled Barnes. She noted that multiple complaints had been filed, multiple warning signs had been evident, and yet the detention facility had done nothing substantive to investigate or stop him. She announced that she would be referring the case to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division for a comprehensive investigation into the facility's policies, training, and complaint procedures, with the potential for federal oversight if systemic failures were confirmed. Then came the sentence. Mr. Barnes, you violated every principle that law enforcement supposedly represents. You betrayed the trust of the community you served, the women you victimized, and every honest officer who puts on a badge to genuinely protect people. Your crimes were not aberrations but calculated predation, systematically executed over years. You've shown no genuine remorse, no real understanding of the devastation you caused. Therefore, I sentence you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole on each count, to be served concurrently. Additionally, I'm imposing a lifetime supervised release should you ever be released, though given this sentence, that seems unlikely. Life without parole. The maximum sentence. Barnes showed his first genuine emotion of the hearing. His face paled, his jaw clenched, his hands gripped the defense table. The reality of spending the rest of his life in federal prison had finally broken through his carefully maintained composure. Federal marshals approached to take him into custody. As they led him from the courtroom, Barnes looked back at his family. His wife and teenage son sitting in the gallery, and for the first time his performance broke completely. He mouthed, "I'm sorry," to them, his eyes filling with tears not for his victims but for himself, for what he'd lost, for the life sentence he'd earned through his monstrous behavior. In the gallery, Diana sat with her attorney, tears streaming down her face, not from sadness but from overwhelming relief and vindication. The system that had failed her so catastrophically had finally delivered justice. The monster who'd hidden behind a badge was going to die in prison. Barnes would spend decades in federal custody, likely in protective custody given that prisoners have their own justice system for those who've committed crimes against the vulnerable, especially when the criminal once wore a badge. After the hearing, Diana spoke to reporters gathered outside the courthouse. She was joined by two other victims who'd testified at trial. Together, they delivered a statement that transcended this single case. "This sentencing doesn't undo what happened to us," Diana said, reading from prepared remarks while her voice shook with emotion. "Nothing can give us back what James Barnes stole. But it proves that even when the system fails, even when predators hide behind badges and authority, justice is still possible. We want every victim of abuse by law enforcement to know that your voice matters, that your truth matters, that you deserve to be believed and protected. And we want every officer who thinks their badge grants permission to harm vulnerable people to know that you will be held accountable. You will be exposed. You will face consequences." The case of James Antonio Barnes became a flashpoint for broader conversations about police accountability, institutional oversight, and how systems can better protect vulnerable populations from those entrusted with authority. Several states passed legislation strengthening protections for detained individuals and creating independent oversight mechanisms for complaints against detention staff. Training programs for law enforcement began incorporating specific modules on recognizing and preventing institutional predation. But perhaps most importantly, Barnes's victims reclaimed something he tried to take from them: their power, their voices, their right to be heard and believed. Diana went on to become an advocate for criminal justice reform and survivors' rights. She testified before legislative committees, spoke at conferences, and helped other victims navigate the terrifying process of coming forward against powerful perpetrators. The monster who'd worn a badge was finally caged. Justice had been delayed but not denied. And in the end, the women Barnes had victimized proved something more powerful than his authority: that courage, truth, and solidarity can defeat even institutional predation. James Antonio Barnes will die in federal prison, his name forever synonymous with betrayal, predation, and the corruption of power. His victims will carry scars, but they also carry something else: the knowledge that they fought back, that they won, and that their courage made the world slightly safer for everyone who comes after them. The hunt is over. The monster is locked away, and the women he tried to destroy are still standing, still fighting, still speaking truth to power. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Butcher of Denver. The Oscar Ray Boland saga. There are predators who kill once and vanish into legend, and then there are those who transform murder into a relentless pattern. Oscar Ray Boland became the latter, a carnival worker whose hands that once assembled rides for children's laughter would soon dismantle young lives with methodical savagery across Florida's sun-scorched highways. Between 1986 and the winter shadows of early 1987, 3 vibrant young women vanished from Tampa Bay's bustling corridors, each disappearance marking another descent into a nightmare that would take decades to fully unravel. Their killer moved among crowds, concealed behind an ordinary face and the transient anonymity of carnival life. But beneath that facade existed something far darker. A calculated destroyer who selected his victims with chilling deliberation, exploited their trust or vulnerability, and extinguished their futures with brutal finality. What emerged from the investigation wasn't just the story of 3 murders, but a haunting portrait of evil hiding in plain sight, of a justice system pushed to its absolute limits, and of families who endured unimaginable anguish waiting for answers that seemed perpetually out of reach. This is the chronicle of Oscar Ray Bolin, husband, father, co-worker, and remorseless killer. The Tampa Bay area in the mid-1980s pulsed with vitality and growth. Shopping centers sprawled across former orange groves, highways stretched like concrete rivers connecting communities, and opportunities beckoned to those willing to chase them. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity and progress, danger lurked in the most unexpected places, waiting for moments of vulnerability to strike. Natalie Bleth, 26 years old, represented everything bright about that era. A bookkeeper whose meticulous nature extended from her professional life into her personal affairs, she possessed striking beauty complemented by a warm, approachable demeanor. On February 20th, 1986, she departed her workplace at a Land O'Lakes business. Her workday concluded, her thoughts likely turning toward evening plans. The drive home should have been routine, a familiar path traveled countless times before. Instead, somewhere along that journey, her trajectory intersected with malevolence incarnate. Her vehicle was discovered abandoned, positioned oddly, as though she had pulled over unexpectedly or been forced from the road. The car's condition suggested no mechanical failure, no rational explanation for why a careful, responsible woman would simply leave it behind. Inside, investigators found her belongings, purse, identification, items that spoke of interrupted normalcy. What they did not find was Natalie herself. She had simply evaporated, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense of dread among those who loved her. Months dissolved into the oppressive heat of a Florida summer, and still no answers emerged. Searchers combed woods and wetlands, investigators pursued leads that crumbled into dead ends, and Natalie's family existed in the excruciating limbo reserved for those whose loved ones neither return nor are confirmed lost. Then, as summer yielded to autumn, hope flickered briefly before being extinguished forever. Hunters stumbled upon human remains in a desolate area of northern Pasco County. The location spoke of intentional concealment, a place where nature's reclamation might erase evidence and identity alike. Forensic examination confirmed the worst. These were Natalie's remains. But the manner of discovery revealed something more sinister than a sudden death. Her body had been subjected to deliberate dismemberment, an act requiring time, privacy, and a staggering absence of empathy. This wasn't passion or rage cooling into regret. This was methodical, purposeful destruction of a human being. The brutality stunned even seasoned investigators. Dismemberment represents one of the most disturbing aspects of homicide, suggesting either an attempt to complicate identification or, more chillingly, a perpetrator comfortable with extended contact with their victim's remains. The psychological profile began taking shape. Someone organized, someone capable of maintaining composure during acts that would shatter most people's sanity, someone who viewed human beings as objects to be manipulated and discarded. While investigators struggled to comprehend the horror of Natalie's fate, the predator had already claimed another life. Stephanie Collins, 17 years old, carried dreams as vast as the Florida sky. Her youth brimmed with possibility, her beauty turning heads, her future stretching endlessly before her. On November 5, 1986, she accepted what seemed an innocuous offer, a ride from someone she knew, at least peripherally, through her workplace connections. Oscar Ray Bolin worked for the traveling carnival circuit, a profession that placed him perpetually in motion, perpetually encountering new faces, perpetually occupying that liminal space between insider and outsider in every community he touched. Stephanie's trust proved fatal. Whatever transpired during that ride ended with her subjected to unimaginable terror. She was beaten with savage intensity, the blows raining down until her young body could withstand no more. Then came the ultimate violation: strangulation, the killer's hands closing around her throat, maintaining pressure as her struggles weakened, as consciousness fled, as life itself departed. But even death provided no sanctuary from his depravity. Her body was transported to a remote location in Pasco County, another desolate stretch where nature might conceal his crimes, and there he set about erasing her very existence through further mutilation. The discovery of Stephanie's remains sent shockwaves through the community. Two young women, both connected however tangentially to the same geographical area, both subjected to extraordinary violence, both dismembered post-mortem. The pattern was undeniable, yet the perpetrator remained frustratingly invisible. Fear began its insidious spread through neighborhoods. Parents tightened restrictions on their children. Women looked over their shoulders with increasing frequency, and investigators worked around the clock pursuing any fragment of evidence that might illuminate the darkness. Winter arrived, bringing with it the holiday season's artificial cheer, but for those tracking this killer, celebration seemed obscene. Then came December 5th, 1986, barely a month after Stephanie Collins's murder, and the predator struck again. Terry Lynn Matthews, 26 years old, vanished while hitchhiking along Highway 60, a decision born perhaps of necessity, perhaps of circumstance, certainly not of foolishness despite how some might judge such choices. Hitchhiking carried risks that everyone understood, yet for some it represented the only viable transportation option. Terry Lynn couldn't have known that the vehicle slowing to offer assistance carried within it her doom. Bolin picked her up, and in doing so sealed her fate. What followed remains difficult to articulate without confronting the absolute worst aspects of human capability. He drove her to an isolated area, a place where screams would dissipate unheard, where struggle would leave no witnesses. There, he subjected her to a prolonged assault that combined physical battery with sexual violation, each act building upon the previous horror. When he finally strangled her, again employing his bare hands, again feeling her life ebb away beneath his grip, it came almost as a perverse mercy after the torments preceding it. Her body was discarded with the same callous disregard shown to his previous victims, left in another remote Pasco County location as though these wooded areas served as his personal dumping grounds. The discovery followed the now familiar pattern: decomposition complicated by deliberate mutilation, a young woman reduced to evidence and statistics, a family thrust into grief's darkest corridors. 3 women, 3 lives extinguished, 3 families shattered. And still, the killer walked free, protected by his mobility, his ordinariness, his ability to blend seamlessly into the working-class fabric of carnival culture. Oscar Ray Bolin had transformed a stretch of Florida highway into his personal hunting ground, and nothing suggested he intended to stop. Detective work, particularly in serial murder cases, demands extraordinary patience coupled with relentless determination. The Pasco County Sheriff's Office found itself confronting a killer whose crimes displayed both organization and escalation. A deadly combination suggesting future violence was inevitable. Physical evidence existed, but forensic technology in the mid to late 1980s lacked the sophistication that would later revolutionize criminal investigations. DNA analysis remained in its infancy, databases didn't connect jurisdictions seamlessly, and much depended upon traditional detective work. Interviews, surveillance, pattern recognition, and occasionally simple fortune. The commonalities between victims began emerging under careful analysis. All 3 women had crossed paths, directly or peripherally, with the traveling carnival circuit that moved through Tampa Bay like a transient city. This realization narrowed the suspect pool considerably, but carnival workers represented a notoriously difficult population to track. Their lifestyle revolved around constant movement, cash transactions, transient relationships, and a culture of anonymity that could shield wrongdoing. Many used aliases, avoided official documentation, and existed largely off-grid by contemporary standards. Oscar Ray Bolin fit perfectly within this demographic. Born into hardship and shaped by instability, he gravitated toward carnival work as many do, seeking employment that asked few questions and offered geographic flexibility. He operated rides, performed maintenance, handled the physical labor that kept the midway functioning. To casual observers, he appeared unremarkable. Average height, average build, average features that blurred into forgettability. He married, fathered children, maintained the external trappings of conventionality. Yet behind this facade existed something profoundly broken, a psychology that permitted, perhaps even craved, the destruction of vulnerable women. Investigators began focusing on Carnival employees, conducting interviews, establishing timelines, searching for gaps in alibis that might correspond with the murders. Boland's name emerged during these inquiries, but initially without particular emphasis. He was one worker among many, one more face in a transient crowd. However, as detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies accumulated. His whereabouts during the relevant time periods couldn't always be accounted for satisfactorily. Associates mentioned behaviors that seemed odd in retrospect, an unusual interest in crime news, comments about women that carried undertones of contempt or objectification, disappearances during work hours that defied easy explanation. The breakthrough came through a combination of forensic evidence and witness testimony. Fibers recovered from victim remains matched materials associated with Boland's vehicle and workplace. Carpet fibers, fabric threads, microscopic transfers that individually meant little but collectively built toward a damning picture. Meanwhile, witnesses began stepping forward with information they'd previously dismissed as insignificant. Someone remembered seeing Boland with Stephanie Collins shortly before her disappearance. Another recalled observing his vehicle in an area proximate to where Terry Lynn Matthews's body was eventually discovered. The circumstantial web tightened strand by strand. Boland's wife at the time, though initially defensive of her husband, eventually provided information that further undermined his position. She described behaviors that alarmed her in hindsight: unexplained absences, blood-stained clothing attributed to work accidents, scratches and injuries whose origins remained vague. The portrait emerging was of a man living a double existence. Respectable husband and father by day, predatory killer when opportunity arose. Arrest came in 1990, years after the murders but representing countless hours of investigative labor. Boland was taken into custody and faced charges for all 3 homicides. The relief felt by investigators was tempered by awareness of the challenges ahead. Building prosecutable cases required transforming circumstantial evidence and witness statements into proof beyond reasonable doubt, a standard deliberately high to protect the innocent but occasionally frustrating when guilt seems evident. The legal proceedings would prove Byzantine in their complexity. Boland faced separate trials for each victim, a strategy allowing prosecutors to present victim-specific evidence without prejudicial spillover. The first trial addressed Natalie Bletha's murder, the case anchored by forensic evidence linking Boland to crime scenes and victim remains. Expert witnesses testified regarding fiber matches. Forensic pathology detailed the violence inflicted upon her body, and prosecutors painted a methodical picture of premeditated murder followed by calculated concealment. The jury deliberated and returned with a guilty verdict, followed by a sentence of death. Florida, like many states during this era, actively employed capital punishment for aggravated murder, and the brutality characterizing these crimes easily met that threshold. The Bleth family experienced a measure of closure, though nothing could truly heal the wound torn through their lives. Subsequent trials for Stephanie Collins and Terry Lynn Matthews followed similar trajectories. Evidence specific to each case was presented, including testimony about the beatings, strangulations, and post-mortem mutilations. Witnesses described seeing Boland with victims shortly before their disappearances. Forensic specialists detailed the physical evidence connecting him to crime scenes. In each instance, juries found him guilty, and judges imposed death sentences. Oscar Ray Boland received 3 separate death penalties, a reflection of the 3 lives he had stolen with such callous brutality. Yet capital punishment's machinery moves slowly, deliberately, hampered by extensive appeals processes designed to ensure accuracy. Boland's legal team mounted numerous challenges, arguing procedural errors, questioning evidence admissibility, seeking retrials based on various grounds. The appellate courts overturned some convictions, necessitating new trials where prosecutors again presented their cases, where families again endured testimony about their loved ones' suffering, where Bolin again faced juries who again found him guilty. This cycle repeated across decades, an exhausting ordeal for everyone involved except perhaps Bolin himself, who seemed to relish the attention and prolonged existence. He gave interviews from prison, displaying a disturbing lack of remorse while occasionally offering cryptic hints about other potential victims. Investigators explored these suggestions but found nothing substantive, leading many to conclude he was simply manipulating the system for whatever satisfaction that provided. Throughout this extended legal odyssey, one bizarre element added surreal texture to an already dark narrative. While incarcerated awaiting execution, Bolin developed a relationship with Rosalie Martinez, one of his former defense attorneys. Despite ethical boundaries that should have prevented such involvement, despite the grotesque nature of his crimes, despite his status as a condemned murderer, Martinez became romantically entangled with her former client. They eventually married while he remained on death row, a union that struck many observers as incomprehensible, a final manipulation by a man whose entire existence seemed predicated on exploiting vulnerabilities in others. The years accumulated 1990, 2000, 2010, and onward, while Bolin existed in the strange limbo of death row, simultaneously alive yet civilly dead, present yet isolated, awaiting an execution date that kept being postponed as legal maneuvers continued their labyrinthine progression through courts. Death row exists as a peculiar space within the American criminal justice landscape, simultaneously warehouse and waiting room, a place where time distorts into something neither fully lived nor properly concluded. Oscar Ray Bolin inhabited this space for over 2 decades, his continued breathing an ongoing insult to the memories of Natalie Bleth, Stephanie Collins, and Terry Lynn Matthews. For their families, each passing year represented another cycle of hope deferred, another chapter of grief renewed, another period of wondering whether justice delayed had become justice denied. The appeals process, though essential to ensuring capital punishment's accuracy, can feel torturous to those awaiting resolution. Every legal challenge, every motion for retrial, every appellate court review extended the timeline between conviction and execution. Bolin's attorneys pursued every available avenue, as was their obligation within the adversarial legal system. They challenged forensic evidence reliability, questioned witness credibility, argued procedural irregularities, and sought relief on grounds ranging from constitutional violations to evolving standards regarding cruel and unusual punishment. Some appeals succeeded, resulting in overturned convictions that necessitated new trials. The rationale varied: issues with jury instructions, problems with evidence presentation, questions about legal representation quality. Each successful appeal meant families had to endure another trial, reliving trauma as prosecutors again laid out the horrific details of their loved one's final hours. Natalie's family heard again about her dismemberment. Stephanie's relatives listened once more to testimony about the beating she endured before strangulation. Terry Lynn's survivors confronted anew the sexual violence accompanying her murder. Yet each retrial concluded identically, guilty verdicts followed by death sentences. The evidence proved too substantial, the pattern too clear, the brutality too extreme for juries to reach any alternative conclusion. Oscar Ray Bolin had murdered 3 women with extraordinary viciousness, and no amount of legal maneuvering could alter that fundamental truth. The retrials served primarily to confirm what had been established initially, adding layers of procedural certainty atop an already solid foundation of guilt. During these years, Bolin himself proved an unsettling presence in the narrative. Unlike some condemned prisoners who adopt silence or express remorse, he seemed to enjoy his notoriety. He granted interviews where he projected an image of calm rationality, discussing his cases with detachment as though analyzing someone else's crimes. He hinted at additional victims without providing concrete details, a manipulation that sent investigators pursuing shadows while likely feeding his ego. He maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence, crafting alternative narratives that placed him as victim of circumstantial coincidence and prosecutorial overreach. His marriage to Rosalie Martinez added a bizarre dimension to these proceedings. The relationship began while she served on his defense team, an ethical violation that raised serious questions about professional boundaries and appropriate conduct. After marrying Bolin, Martinez continued advocating for him publicly, appearing in media interviews to discuss his case, maintaining his innocence despite having had access to evidence and documentation that should have disabused any reasonable person of such notions. Their union became tabloid fodder, analyzed by psychologists attempting to understand why an educated professional would bind herself to a condemned serial killer. Some theorized Stockholm Syndrome in reverse, a defense attorney becoming so invested in her client's humanity that she lost perspective on his inhumanity. Others suggested a savior complex, a belief that her love could somehow redeem or reform someone whose actions demonstrated profound moral bankruptcy. A darker interpretation proposed that Martinez herself possessed psychological peculiarities that drew her toward precisely this type of relationship, finding appeal in the forbidden, the dangerous, the irredeemable. Whatever the explanation, the marriage stood as testament to Boland's continued ability to manipulate and exploit, even from within maximum security confinement. Meanwhile, advancements in forensic science offered retrospective vindication of the original convictions. DNA analysis, increasingly sophisticated throughout the 1990s and 2000s, provided definitive biological links between Boland and his victims. Evidence that had relied on fiber matching and circumstantial connections gained genetic confirmation. Blood, hair, bodily fluids, materials that might have been questioned earlier now spoke with scientific certainty. These findings eliminated any lingering ambiguity about Boland's guilt, transforming what had been very strong circumstantial cases into absolute biological certainty. The families of the victims aged through these decades, parents becoming elderly, siblings moving through their own life milestones marked by absence. Birthdays arrived annually for women who would never celebrate them. Graduations occurred that they would never attend. Weddings happened without their participation. Children were born who would never know their aunts or their mother. The ripple effects of Boland's violence extended outward indefinitely, touching dozens if not hundreds of lives, creating voids that could never be adequately filled. Victim advocacy groups rallied around these families, providing support networks and amplifying their voices in discussions about criminal justice reform. The Bleth, Collins, and Matthews families became reluctant spokespersons for issues surrounding capital punishment, victims' rights, and the psychological toll of prolonged legal proceedings. They testified before legislative bodies, participated in documentary projects, and shared their stories with media outlets, transforming private grief into public advocacy while hoping their experiences might somehow benefit others navigating similar nightmares. Public sentiment regarding capital punishment shifted considerably during Boland's incarceration. National conversations about execution methods, wrongful convictions, racial disparities in sentencing, and the death penalty's efficacy as deterrent gained prominence. Some jurisdictions abolished capital punishment entirely, citing moral objections or practical concerns about irreversible errors. Florida, however, maintained its death penalty statute, though implementing it with increasing infrequency as appeals processes lengthened and societal ambivalence grew. For Boland specifically, the strength of evidence insulated his case from broader debates about capital punishment's application. Even many death penalty opponents acknowledged that if executions were to occur, cases like his, involving multiple murders, extreme brutality, sexual violence, and victims including a teenage girl, represented the most defensible applications. The question wasn't whether he deserved the ultimate penalty, but rather when that penalty would finally be administered. As the calendar turned toward 2016, nearly 3 decades after the murders, momentum finally built toward execution. Final appeals had been exhausted, last-minute legal maneuvers had failed, and Florida officials scheduled an execution date. The machinery of death, so long dormant regarding Boland specifically, lurched into motion. January 7, 2016, arrived as dates due, indifferent to human significance, simply another rotation of the planet marked by humans with special meaning. For Oscar Ray Boland, it represented the termination point toward which he'd been traveling since that day in 1990 when authorities first placed him in custody. For the families of Natalie Bleth, Stephanie Collins, and Terry Lynn Matthews, it offered something inadequately described as closure. More accurately, perhaps, a punctuation mark on decades of anguish, a formal conclusion to a chapter that would never truly end. Florida State Prison in Stark houses the state's execution chamber, a clinical space designed to transform killing into procedure, to sanitize death through medical aesthetics and bureaucratic protocol. The execution process itself involves layers of verification, documentation, and ritual, each step carefully scripted to provide the appearance of solemnity and certainty. Witnesses assemble, family members of victims, media representatives, prison officials, legal observers, each present for different reasons but united in witnessing the state's ultimate expression of justice. Bolin was prepared according to standard protocols. Final appeals had been rejected by courts at multiple levels, including the United States Supreme Court, which declined to intervene. His last meal request was fulfilled, a final nod to condemned prisoners' humanity even as the state prepared to end that humanity. He met with spiritual advisors if he so chose, though his engagement with religious or philosophical comfort remains unclear. His wife, Rosalie Martinez, visited one final time, their farewell occurring in a space designed to prevent physical contact while allowing conversation, a metaphor for their entire relationship. Proximity without genuine connection, words without meaningful substance. The hours preceding execution follow rigid schedules, each minute allocated, each activity prescribed. Bolin was transported from his cell to the execution chamber, secured to the gurney with leather restraints that ensured immobility while maintaining the appearance of humaneness. Death administered to a person reclined as if resting, not struggling against bonds. Intravenous lines were established in his arms, the conduits through which the state would introduce the chemical cocktail designed to stop his heart. Florida, like many states, had evolved its execution methodology over decades, abandoning electrocution in favor of lethal injection based on claims of greater humanity. The three-drug protocol, an anesthetic to induce unconsciousness, a paralytic to cease breathing, and potassium chloride to stop the heart, promised death disguised as medical procedure. Debate raged regarding whether this method truly prevented suffering or merely concealed it behind chemical paralysis. But such controversies didn't alter the evening's outcome. Witnesses filed into their designated viewing area, separated from the execution chamber by glass that allowed observation while maintaining physical separation. The families of Bolin's victims occupied special seating, their presence representing the human cost of his crimes. Some came seeking closure, others driven by a need to witness accountability, still others simply because absence seemed worse than presence. Emotional responses varied. Some wept quietly, others maintained stoic composure. A few displayed visible anger that even execution couldn't fully satisfy. Bolin was offered opportunity for final words, the condemned person's traditional prerogative to address witnesses and history before departing existence. What transpired in those moments remains subject to various accounts, but reportedly he declined to apologize or express remorse, maintaining instead a posture of defiance or denial that characterized his decades on death row. For families hoping for acknowledgement of their pain, for admission of guilt, for any gesture toward redemption, his silence or deflection represented a final insult, a last demonstration of the same callousness that had enabled his crimes originally. The warden signaled, and the execution commenced. The first drug entered Bolin's bloodstream, intended to render him unconscious within seconds. Witnesses observed for signs of distress, debate continuing about whether observable reactions indicated suffering or merely reflexive responses from a body already chemically compromised. The paralytic followed, ceasing respiratory function, eliminating any possibility of verbal expression or voluntary movement. Finally, the potassium chloride, stopping his heart, ending the biological processes that constitute life. Medical personnel monitored vital signs, waiting for the flat line that confirmed death. The process typically requires 10 to 15 minutes from commencement to official pronouncement, a span of time during which witnesses sit in silence, watching a man transition from living to dead, from breathing to still, from present to past tense. At 10:16 p.m., officials declared Oscar Ray Bolin deceased 30 years and 2 months after Natalie Bletha's murder, nearly 3 decades since his crimes transformed multiple families' lives into ongoing nightmares. The aftermath of executions follows its own rituals. Official statements are released, confirming the sentence's implementation. Media reports disseminate, informing the public that justice, however delayed, has been administered. Family members of victims provide statements if they choose, articulating feelings that range from relief to emptiness to ongoing anger. Some express satisfaction that the killer can harm no one else. Others acknowledge that execution doesn't resurrect loved ones or heal wounds. Still others simply feel exhausted by the prolonged ordeal finally concluded. Natalie Bletha's family members spoke of their decades-long wait, describing the emotional toll of repeated trials and endless appeals. They expressed gratitude for investigators' persistence and prosecutors' dedication, while acknowledging that Boland's death couldn't restore what he'd stolen. Natalie remained gone, her potential unrealized, her absence permanent regardless of her killer's fate. Stephanie Collins's relatives similarly described relief mixed with sorrow. Their teenage daughter, sister, niece had been denied the opportunity to mature into adulthood, to pursue dreams, to build the life she deserved. Boland's execution represented accountability but not restoration, punishment but not healing. They hoped her memory would outlast his, that she would be remembered for her vibrancy rather than reduced to simply another murder victim. Terry Lynn Matthews's family echoed these sentiments, emphasizing that while execution concluded Boland's chapter, their own narrative of loss would continue indefinitely. They advocated for system reforms that might expedite justice for future victims' families, sparing others the 3-decade ordeal they'd endured. They also highlighted the importance of remembering victims as whole people rather than statistics in crime databases. Rosalie Martinez, Boland's widow, issued statements maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence and multiple convictions by different juries across separate trials. Her continued advocacy for a demonstrably guilty man struck many observers as either delusional or willfully ignorant, a final illustration of Boland's manipulative capacities extending beyond death. She spoke of appealing to higher authorities, seeking posthumous exoneration, pursuing vindication that would never arrive because the evidence against him remained irrefutable and extensive. In the weeks and months following execution, media retrospectives examined Boland's crimes, the investigation's challenges, and the prolonged legal proceedings. True crime documentaries featured his case, analyzing the forensic evidence, interviewing investigators, and exploring the psychological profile of a serial killer who targeted vulnerable women. These examinations served educational purposes, illustrating investigative techniques and legal processes, while also risking the fetishization of violence that sometimes characterizes true crime genres. The communities where Boland's crimes occurred moved forward, though scars remained. Memorials honored the victims, ensuring their names and faces persisted in collective memory. Advocacy organizations used their cases to promote women's safety initiatives, support services for victims' families, and reforms addressing the death penalty's implementation. The tragedy became transformed, however inadequately, into purpose, a determination that these deaths would somehow generate positive change, that meaning could be wrested from horror. Oscar Ray Boland's execution closed a chapter spanning 3 decades, thousands of pages of legal documents, countless hours of investigation and prosecution, and immeasurable suffering among victims' families. His death satisfied the state's prescribed penalty for his crimes, but couldn't undo the damage he'd inflicted. 3 women remained dead, their lives shortened by a predator who encountered them during moments of vulnerability and chose violence. Families continued grieving losses no punishment could remedy. A community's sense of security, once shattered, could never be completely restored. The case endures as a stark reminder of evil's persistence, justice's complexity, and human fragility. It demonstrates that monsters rarely announce themselves as such. They often appear ordinary, blend into communities, exploit trust before revealing their true nature. It illustrates the challenges confronting law enforcement when hunting predators who understand how to exploit anonymity and mobility. And it reveals the agonizing cost paid by victims' families when justice moves slowly, when legal proceedings stretch across decades, when closure remains perpetually deferred. In the final accounting, Oscar Ray Boland extinguished 3 lives and damaged dozens more through ripple effects of trauma. His own life ended by state sanction, a deliberate termination mirroring his own deliberate killings but administered through legal process rather than individual violence. Whether this constitutes justice, vengeance, or simply society's necessary response to intolerable evil remains subject to individual interpretation, but the facts stand immutable. He killed, was caught, was convicted, and was executed. The narrative concluded not with redemption or revelation, but simply with ending. His life terminated as he had terminated others, though through procedures that attempted to preserve human dignity even when administering ultimate punishment. The darkness Oscar Ray Bolin embodied has been extinguished, but the shadows he cast remain, reminders that vigilance against predatory violence must persist, that vulnerable populations deserve protection, and that justice, however imperfect and delayed, represents civilization's attempt to impose order upon chaos and exact accountability from those who would destroy innocent lives. His victims' memories endure, their stolen potential acknowledged, their humanity affirmed against his dehumanizing violence. In this, if nothing else, light prevails over darkness, remembrance over erasure, and the fundamental value of each life asserted against the nihilism of murder. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.